Storm clouds swallowed England's northern frontier the night Duke Lucien Ravenscar returned to his fortress like a conqueror stepping back into hell. Blackthorn. Keep rose from the moorland like a tombstone carved for the living, where power meant survival and mercy invited daggers to your spine. This is a story about the most dangerous aristocrat in England discovering that owning everything means protecting nothing, and the woman who walked into his fortress refusing to kneel before anyone. If you want to watch a man built from violence learn what it costs to actually care about something, stay until the end. Drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from, and hit that like button because this tale gets darker before it burns bright. The iron gates of Blackthorn Keep screamed open like wounded animals as Duke Lucien Ravenscar's carriage tore through the entrance at speeds that would have killed lesser drivers. Servants scattered across the courtyard like prey animals sensing a predator's return. Rain hammered the cobblestones with the kind of violence that matched the energy radiating from the carriage itself before it even stopped moving. Lucien stepped out into the storm without acknowledging the footmen scrambling to hold an umbrella over ducal shoulders that didn't need protecting. Water streamed down black wool, tailored with military precision across a frame built for warfare rather than drawing rooms. His face carried the kind of beauty sculptors captured in marble, all harsh angles and aristocratic brutality, but his eyes held something far more dangerous than mere handsomeness. They were the color of winter storms over the North Sea, calculating and merciless. The eyes of a man who'd learned before his 10th birthday that showing weakness got you destroyed. He was 32 years old and commanded more territory than some European princes. Half of Parliament feared him. The other half pretended they didn't while signing whatever legislation kept Ravenscar influence away from their own estates. The keep's steward, Graves, materialized from the shadows of the main entrance like he'd been standing there since the Crusades. The old man had served 3 generations of Ravenscars and survived by understanding when to speak and when to become invisible. "Your Grace," he said with a bow calculated to show respect without suggesting servility. "Your correspondence awaits in the study. The estate reports indicate productivity increased 12% during your absence." Lucien stripped off rain-soaked gloves while walking past Graves without slowing his stride. His boots echoed against black marble floors that reflected candlelight like pools of frozen oil. The sound carried authority, each footfall a declaration of ownership over every stone in this ancestral prison. "Send the reports to my chambers. Clear my schedule until noon tomorrow. No interruptions unless the estate is burning or the king himself demands an audience." He moved through corridors lined with portraits of dead Ravenscars who'd built this dynasty through calculated brutality. His great-grandfather had crushed a mining rebellion by flooding the tunnels with 300 workers still inside. His grandfather had bankrupted 4 competing families during a single parliamentary session. His father had taught him that love was a weapon enemies used to make you vulnerable, right before dying in Lucien's arms from poison, delivered by a mistress he'd trusted too completely. Every lesson carved into Lucien's psyche pointed toward the same truth. Power protected you. Attachment destroyed you, and mercy was just another word for suicide. The ducal chambers occupied the keep's highest tower, a statement of dominance visible for miles across Ravenscar lands. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked territory stretching to the horizon, thousands of acres generating wealth that funded parliamentary influence and private armies. Lucien poured himself whiskey older than most of the servants and stood before those windows like a general surveying conquered ground. This was his kingdom. These were his people. Everything within sight answered to Ravenscar authority or learned to regret the oversight. The decanter was still in his hand when Graves knocked with the particular rhythm that meant urgent business that couldn't wait until morning. "Enter." The steward carried a leather portfolio embossed with the seal of Westminster Legal Chambers. "Your Grace, this arrived under priority dispatch. The solicitors indicated immediate review was essential." Lucien took the portfolio without comment and dismissed Graves with a gesture. Inside were contracts, property deeds, and a marriage proposal arranged by men who understood that aristocratic unions had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with strategic advantage. Lady Seraphina Vale, only daughter of the financially ruined Earl of Wintermere, available for matrimonial alliance in exchange for debt restructuring and estate preservation. Lucien had never met the woman, didn't particularly care to before the wedding. Marriage was a business transaction, nothing more complicated than acquiring mineral rights or purchasing parliamentary votes. The Vale family controlled border territories adjacent to Ravenscar lands. Their collapse would create power vacuums his enemies might exploit. Better to absorb them through legal means than risk instability. He signed the contracts with the same emotional investment he'd use approving crop rotation schedules. 3 weeks later, Lady Seraphina Vale arrived at Blackthorn Keep in a carriage that looked expensive until you noticed the wheels needed replacing and the horses showed signs of inadequate feeding. The Vale family's decline hadn't been gradual. It had been catastrophic, the kind of financial destruction that happened when weak men tried playing power games against opponents who actually understood violence. Lucien watched her arrival from the tower windows with the detached interest of a collector examining a recently acquired painting. She stepped from the carriage wearing silver silk that caught afternoon light like liquid mercury, her movements carrying the trained grace of aristocratic breeding. Dark hair fell in carefully arranged waves that probably took her lady's maid hours to perfect. Her face held classical beauty, fine-boned and elegant, but it was her eyes that made Lucien pause. They weren't the eyes of a defeated woman being sold to save her family. They were the eyes of someone who'd already calculated every angle of this nightmare and decided survival meant playing a longer game than anyone expected. Interesting. The wedding ceremony happened in Blackthorn's ancient chapel, with exactly enough witnesses to satisfy legality and no guests beyond those required by protocol. Seraphina stood beside him in white silk and spoke her vows with perfect diction and zero emotion, as if reading shipping manifests rather than binding herself to a man rumored to have killed his last mistress for attempting to manipulate him politically. The rumor was false. The mistress had simply been relocated to France with enough money to ensure her silence. But Lucien never corrected the story because fear was more useful than truth. After the ceremony, they endured a formal dinner where minor nobility consumed expensive food while pretending not to stare at the new Duchess of Ravenscar like spectators watching a prisoner being led to execution. Seraphina played her role flawlessly, responding to conversation with exactly the right balance of warmth and aristocratic distance. She laughed at appropriate moments. She deflected intrusive questions with practiced skill. She gave no indication that marrying Lucien represented anything more traumatic than changing residences. But when their eyes met across the candlelit table, Lucien recognized something he'd only seen in mirrors. She was performing, just like he was. Every smile calculated, every gesture rehearsed. They were both actors playing roles written by circumstances neither had chosen. The dinner finally ended near midnight. Servants cleared the hall while Lucien led his new wife through corridors toward the ducal chambers. Their footsteps echoed in perfect counterpoint, hers lighter but no less purposeful than his own. He opened the chamber doors, revealing rooms decorated with masculine severity. Dark wood, leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing military strategy and political philosophy. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, flames casting shadows that danced across stone like restless spirits. Seraphina entered without hesitation and turned to face him with the kind of composure that came from aristocratic training or complete emotional shutdown. Possibly both. Lucien closed the doors and poured 2 glasses of wine without asking if she wanted any. He handed her one, while his other hand loosened his cravat with practiced efficiency. "Let me clarify expectations," he said with the same tone he'd use explaining estate management to new stewards. "You are Duchess of Ravenscar now. That title comes with specific responsibilities. You will manage household operations, host social functions, and produce heirs to continue the bloodline. In exchange, you receive protection, status, and financial security your family lost through their own incompetence." He moved to stand before the fireplace, his silhouette backlit by flames that turned him into something carved from darkness itself. "I don't require affection. I don't expect emotional attachment. Those are luxuries people with nothing to lose can afford. What I require is obedience, discretion, and competence. Deliver those 3 things, and your life here will be comfortable. Fail to deliver them, and you'll discover why every family in England fears Ravenscar displeasure." Seraphina took a small sip of wine while her eyes never left his face. When she spoke, her voice carried the same carefully modulated tone she'd used all evening, revealing nothing. "I understand the terms of our arrangement, Your Grace. My family's survival depends on this marriage succeeding by your definition of success. I have no illusions about romantic love or partnership. You've purchased my cooperation, not my devotion." She set the wine glass down on a side table with precise delicacy. "However, I should clarify my own expectations. I will fulfill every duty you've outlined. I will manage your household efficiently, I will host your political allies with grace. I will provide heirs if biology cooperates. But understand this clearly. You own my time and my public loyalty. You do not own my thoughts, my private opinions, or my sense of self. I will play the role of devoted duchess before the world. In private, we both know what this actually is. She moved toward the adjoining chamber that would serve as her personal quarters, pausing in the doorway. I survived my family's collapse by learning which battles were worth fighting. This marriage isn't one of them, but neither am I a possession you can reshape according to your preferences. We have an arrangement, Your Grace, not a surrender. Then she closed the door between them with a soft click that somehow carried more finality than slamming it would have achieved. Lucien stood alone before the fire and realized his new wife was far more dangerous than her family's weakness had suggested. She wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. She was strategically retreating while maintaining defensive positions most people wouldn't even recognize as fortifications. He drained his wine glass and acknowledged a truth he'd never admit aloud. For the first time in his adult life, Duke Lucien Ravenscar had just encountered someone who might actually be capable of surviving him. The following weeks established patterns that would define their marriage in ways neither anticipated. Seraphina transformed into the perfect duchess with terrifying efficiency. She memorized every servant's name within days. She reorganized household operations with strategic precision that actually improved the keep's legendary efficiency. She hosted a parliamentary dinner party that left visiting aristocrats genuinely impressed rather than simply intimidated, which was a first for Blackthorn Keep in living memory. But she maintained absolute emotional distance from Lucien himself. They shared chambers only when conception required it, encounters that were physically functional but carried all the warmth of contract negotiations. She never complained, never demanded attention, never asked for anything beyond what their arrangement specifically entitled her to receive. It was exactly what Lucien had said he wanted: complete professional competence without emotional complication. So why did it start bothering him like a splinter working deeper beneath the skin? He began noticing small things. The way Seraphina's smile never quite reached her eyes during social functions. How she moved through the keep like a ghost haunting rooms rather than inhabiting them. The fact that servants respected her efficiency but never seemed to warm to her the way they had with his mother before her death. His mother. Dead 15 years now from illness the doctors couldn't cure and grief they refused to acknowledge. She'd loved his father, despite the man being incapable of returning that affection, and the unrequited devotion had slowly poisoned her from the inside. Lucien had sworn at her funeral that he'd never allow emotion to make him that vulnerable. Love was a weapon. Attachment was weakness. Control was the only thing protecting you from being destroyed by people who'd exploit any opening in your defenses. 1 month into the marriage, Lucien discovered Seraphina in the keep's abandoned east wing, where his mother's personal gardens had died from neglect. The space had been closed for years, windows shuttered, furniture covered with dust sheets. Seraphina had somehow convinced Graves to reopen it without requesting ducal permission. She stood in the center of what had been a solarium, afternoon light streaming through freshly cleaned windows. Dead plants surrounded her like a graveyard for things that had once grown beautiful. She held pruning shears and wore a simple day dress rather than formal gowns, her hair tied back practically. Lucien watched from the doorway as she examined a withered rosebush with the focus of a surgeon studying a patient's wounds. "This wing is closed," he said with enough edge to remind her that unauthorized decisions had consequences. Seraphina didn't startle, didn't even turn around immediately. She made one careful cut on the dead plant before responding. "This wing was your mother's personal sanctuary. I found her journals in the library. She spent years cultivating these gardens before illness confined her to bed. Closing them dishonored her memory more than my reopening them ever could." She finally turned to face him, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Keep, her mask slipped enough to show genuine emotion underneath. "You want me to be Duchess here? Fine. But that title means more than hosting dinners and producing heirs. It means being custodian of this estate's legacy, including the parts you've tried to bury. Your mother understood something you've forgotten. Power without purpose becomes prison. She tried to use Ravenscar influence to actually improve people's lives. You've turned it into nothing more than a weapon for maintaining control." Lucien moved into the solarium with predatory focus. His presence seemed to compress the air between them until standing this close felt like standing near open flames. "You know nothing about my mother. Nothing about why this wing was closed. Nothing about the lessons her weakness taught me. Seraphina held her ground despite 6 feet and 200 pounds of controlled violence looming over her. Her voice stayed steady, but dropped low enough that every word carried weight. I know she loved your father despite him being incapable of loving her back. I know that unrequited devotion killed her as surely as any disease. I know you watched it happen and decided love itself was the enemy rather than your father's inability to recognize what he had. She set down the pruning shears with deliberate care. But here's what you haven't figured out yet, Your Grace. You're so terrified of becoming her that you've turned yourself into him instead. You've built a fortress where nothing can hurt you because nothing can reach you. You've confused isolation with strength. And somewhere beneath all that armor, the part of you that still remembers being human is suffocating. The words hit like physical blows. Lucien's hand shot out and gripped her wrist hard enough to leave marks, pulling her close enough that she could feel the fury radiating off him like heat from forged steel. You don't get to psychoanalyze me. You don't get to pretend you understand anything about survival in a world that views compassion as exploitable weakness. I've kept this estate powerful and these people protected precisely because I refused to make my mother's mistakes. Seraphina met his storm-gray eyes without flinching. When she spoke, her voice carried something more dangerous than anger. It carried pity. No, Lucien. You've kept yourself powerful and everyone else at a distance. There's a difference. And deep down, you know it. He released her wrist and stepped back like she'd burned him. For several heartbeats, they stood there surrounded by dead gardens and afternoon light, two people locked in a truth neither wanted to acknowledge. Then Lucien turned and walked away without another word, because staying would have required admitting she was right. That night established a new pattern in their marriage. Seraphina continued restoring his mother's abandoned gardens despite Lucien's obvious displeasure. She brought in botanists from London. She had servants clear decades of neglect from the solarium and attached greenhouses. Within weeks, new plants arrived in careful shipments, expensive varieties that would take years to fully mature. Lucien watched the restoration from tower windows, like a general observing enemy fortifications being built on his own territory. He could have stopped it with a single command. Should have stopped it, really, because allowing his wife to operate with this much autonomy set dangerous precedents. But he didn't issue that command, and the fact that he couldn't explain why bothered him more than the gardens themselves. Meanwhile, Seraphina's influence spread beyond the keep's walls in ways that forced Lucien's attention despite his preference for distance. She started visiting tenant farms and mining villages that supplied Ravenscar wealth. She wore expensive gowns into communities where children went hungry and miners died from easily preventable accidents. She didn't bring charity. She brought uncomfortable questions directed at the estate managers who'd been skimming profits for years. The first time one of those managers complained directly to Lucien about the Duchess interfering in administrative matters, he'd almost sided with the man out of pure institutional habit. Then he reviewed the accounting records Seraphina had quietly compiled and discovered systematic theft that had been happening for over a decade. He had the manager arrested that same afternoon, publicly, in the village square where his theft had done the most damage. Then he personally oversaw restitution payments to families who'd been cheated, because letting Seraphina's investigation end without visible consequences would have undermined both their authorities. But afterwards, standing in his study reviewing updated estate reports, Lucien realized something that felt like losing ground in a battle he hadn't known he was fighting. Seraphina wasn't trying to survive their marriage anymore. She was trying to transform it, and she was succeeding in ways he couldn't counter without revealing exactly how much her presence had started affecting him. 3 months after the wedding, everything changed during a routine social function that should have been completely unremarkable. Lord Cedric Winthrop hosted a winter masquerade at his country estate, one of those mandatory aristocratic gatherings where half of England's nobility got drunk while pretending to conduct important political conversations. Attending was non-negotiable for someone of Lucien's status, even though he'd rather have spent the evening reviewing military dispatches than making small talk with fools. Seraphina prepared for the masquerade with her usual efficiency. She wore midnight blue silk that moved like liquid shadow, and a silver mask decorated with small diamonds that caught candlelight every time she turned her head. She looked devastating in the calculated way aristocratic women weaponized beauty at social functions. They arrived fashionably late in a carriage bearing Ravenscar crests that guaranteed immediate attention from other guests. Lucien offered his arm with mechanical politeness. Seraphina accepted with the same emotional investment someone might show accepting a dinner roll. They entered Lord Winthrop's ballroom to the kind of attention reserved for royalty or natural disasters. Conversations didn't quite stop, but they modulated into quieter registers as people tracked the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar's progress across polished marble floors. The evening proceeded exactly as these events always did. Lucien endured political conversations that were really negotiations disguised as small talk. Seraphina charmed visiting dignitaries with practiced grace. They danced once out of social obligation, their movements technically perfect but emotionally hollow, like clockwork figures performing programmed routines. Then Lord Cedric Winthrop got drunk enough to confuse courage with stupidity. Lucien was discussing mining regulations with several parliamentary allies when Cedric's voice cut through nearby conversations with the particular clarity of someone who'd lost control of their volume. "Tell me, Duchess," the man said loudly enough to draw attention from surrounding groups. "How does it feel being the prettiest bankruptcy sale in recent memory? I hear your father practically begged Ravenscar to take you off his hands before creditors started seizing family heirlooms." The ballroom didn't quite freeze, but conversation stumbled into awkward pauses as people registered what had just been said. Insulting a duchess publicly was social suicide. Insulting the Duchess of Ravenscar specifically was the kind of mistake people wrote cautionary tales about. Seraphina's expression never changed. She maintained the same pleasant mask she'd worn all evening, as if Cedric had commented on the weather rather than delivering a calculated insult designed to humiliate her before England's elite. "My father made a strategic alliance that benefits both families," she said with precisely modulated calm. "I'm certain you understand how these arrangements work, Lord Winthrop. After all, didn't your own marriage result from gambling debts your father couldn't otherwise repay? It was a perfectly executed counterstrike, delivered with enough grace to avoid appearing defensive while still drawing blood." Several observers actually smiled despite the tension crackling through the room, but Cedric was too drunk or too stupid to recognize he should retreat. He took a step closer to Seraphina with the kind of aggressive posturing men used when they decided intimidation was easier than wit. "At least my wife came with a dowry instead of a bill of sale." That was when Lucien moved. He crossed the marble floor like violence given human form, covering the distance between his conversation and Cedric's location in heartbeats. His hand clamped around Cedric's throat before the man could even register the Duke's approach. Then Lucien slammed him backwards against a decorative pillar hard enough that the impact cracked stone and drove the air from Cedric's lungs in a breathless gasp. The entire ballroom went silent, not the polite hush of people pretending not to notice something awkward, the absolute silence of witnesses watching someone about to die. Lucien's voice came out quiet and cold as a blade drawn from ice. "No man speaks her name with disrespect while breathing under my roof or anyone else's. You've insulted the Duchess of Ravenscar. That means you've insulted me. And I don't forgive insults, Cedric. I bury them." His grip tightened enough to make Cedric's face flush red, then purple. The man's hand scrabbled uselessly at ducal fingers that might as well have been iron. "Apologize to my wife," Lucien said with the same tone he'd use ordering breakfast. "Apologize convincingly, or I'll crush your windpipe and explain to the magistrate how you died from alcohol poisoning. Your choice." He released Cedric just enough to allow speech. The man sucked in desperate air and managed to choke out something that resembled an apology through damaged vocal cords and absolute terror. Lucien held him there for 3 more seconds, long enough to ensure everyone in the ballroom understood this wasn't political theater or aristocratic posturing. This was genuine threat of lethal violence barely leashed by civilized convention. Then he released Cedric and stepped back while straightening his coat with the casual precision of a man who hadn't just committed assault before hundreds of witnesses. The ballroom remained frozen in shocked silence as Lucien offered his arm to Seraphina with exactly the same mechanical politeness he'd shown at the beginning of the evening. "We're leaving." They walked out together through a corridor of stunned nobility. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just watched the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar exit like survivors watching a hurricane pass overhead. The carriage ride back to Blackthorn Keep happened in absolute silence. Seraphina stared out the window at moonlit countryside. Lucien sat rigid across from her, his breathing still slightly elevated from adrenaline that hadn't fully dissipated. They didn't speak during the walk from carriage to keep, didn't acknowledge each other climbing the tower stairs, maintained perfect silence until they reached the ducal chambers, and Seraphina finally turned to face him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. "You defended me like property," she said quietly. like someone had damaged something you owned, not like someone had insulted a woman you cared about as a person. Her words carried no anger, just exhausted disappointment that somehow cut deeper than rage would have. Lucien felt something crack open inside his chest, some carefully maintained wall-developing fissures under pressure he'd never learned how to withstand. "I defended you because you're my wife." "No," Seraphina said, while removing her diamond mask with slow deliberation. "You defended your pride, your reputation, your authority. You defended the Ravenscar name. I just happen to be attached to it now." She set the mask on a side table and looked at him with eyes that had stopped pretending months ago. "You're so convinced that caring about anything makes you vulnerable that you've turned yourself into exactly what you fear most. Your father couldn't love your mother, so you've decided you can't love anyone. But here's the truth you keep running from, Lucy. Being incapable of caring doesn't make you strong. It makes you empty. And somewhere beneath all that armor, you know it." Then she walked to her adjoining chamber and closed the door, leaving Lucien alone with truths he'd spent his entire adult life trying to escape. He stood there in the dark chambers for a long time, her words echoing in his head like accusations he couldn't answer. Because deep beneath the armor and authority and carefully constructed defenses, Duke Lucien Ravenscar had started to realize something that terrified him more than any political enemy or financial threat ever could. He was falling in love with his wife, and he had absolutely no idea how to survive that. The confession hung in the dark chambers like smoke after gunfire. Lucien stood alone with a truth that felt like swallowing ground glass. He was falling in love with his wife. The realization didn't arrive as some romantic revelation accompanied by violins and moonlight. It arrived like a diagnosis of terminal illness, something invading his system that he couldn't cut out without killing himself in the process. He poured whiskey with hands that stayed steady through pure discipline. The liquid burned down his throat but did nothing to cauterize the wound Seraphina's words had opened. Being incapable of caring doesn't make you strong. It makes you empty. She'd spoken with the clinical precision of a surgeon identifying exactly where the rot had taken root. The worst part was knowing she was right. Lucien moved to the windows overlooking Ravenscar territory, spreading toward distant horizons. His kingdom, his responsibility. Thousands of people depending on ducal authority to maintain order in a world that would devour weakness without hesitation. He'd built this power structure stone by stone, crushing threats before they could manifest, eliminating vulnerabilities before enemies could exploit them. Love was the ultimate vulnerability. It gave opponents a target they could strike to destroy you from the inside. His father's voice echoed from childhood memories with the clarity of recent conversation. A Ravenscar who allows attachment becomes a Ravenscar who can be controlled. Show me a man who loves something, and I'll show you a man I can break. The old Duke had proven that philosophy repeatedly throughout Lucien's youth. Every friend who got too close eventually received incentives to betray that friendship. Every mentor who showed genuine care found themselves transferred to distant properties. Every woman Lucien showed interest in during his teenage years mysteriously lost interest after private conversations with his father. The lesson had been carved deep. Care about nothing that can be taken away, or spend your life watching enemies take everything. But Seraphina hadn't been taken away. She'd walked in voluntarily, signed contracts binding herself to this nightmare, and then refused to play by any rules that made sense. She didn't try to manipulate him with affection, didn't weaponize sexuality or emotional vulnerability. She just existed in his space with that infuriating combination of competence and distance, transforming his fortress into something almost resembling a home, while maintaining walls around herself that matched his own. And somehow that made her more dangerous than any opponent he'd ever faced, because she wasn't attacking his defenses. She was making him want to lower them himself. The knock on his chamber door came just after midnight, soft but deliberate, carrying intention rather than hesitation. Lucien opened it to find Graves holding a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. "Your Grace, urgent correspondence from Westminster." The messenger indicated immediate response was required. Lucien broke the seal and scanned contents that transformed his night from personally complicated to politically catastrophic. 3 noble houses, including Winthrop, had filed formal complaints with Parliament regarding his conduct at the Masquerade. They were calling for official censure, possibly even investigation into whether the Duke of Ravenscar had become unstable enough to threaten the social order. It was political theater designed to test his influence and create openings for rivals. Under normal circumstances, Lucien would have crushed this maneuvering before it gained momentum. But these weren't normal circumstances. He'd committed public assault because someone insulted his wife. That wasn't rational political calculation. That was emotional reaction. Exactly the kind of vulnerability his enemies had been waiting years to exploit. Send word to my solicitors. Full defensive preparation. And summon Lord Blackwood. I need eyes on who's actually coordinating this beyond Winthrop. Graves bowed and disappeared while Lucien stared at the letter, feeling something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Not fear exactly, more like the recognition that the ground beneath him had started shifting in ways he couldn't control through force alone. He was still holding the letter when Seraphina's door opened. She wore a nightgown covered by a silk robe, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the armored duchess she presented to the world. "I heard Graves," she said quietly. "Is something wrong?" Lucien handed her the letter without comment. She read quickly, her expression shifting from neutral to calculating in the space of 3 paragraphs. "They're using what happened at the Masquerade to build a case that you're losing control. This isn't about Cedric's insult. This is coordinated political assault disguised as concern for social stability." She set the letter down and met his eyes with that unnerving directness she'd maintained since their first meeting. "This happened because you defended me, because you allowed emotion to override political calculation. And now your enemies think they found an exploitable weakness." Lucien felt his jaw tighten until teeth ground together. "Everything you just said is correct. Which is why getting emotionally involved with anyone was always strategic suicide. My father understood that. Every Ravenscar before him understood that. I forgot that lesson for approximately 30 seconds at a masquerade, and now I'm dealing with political consequences that could undermine decades of carefully built influence." Seraphina studied him with an expression that carried something beyond her usual cool assessment. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that he had to lean closer to hear properly. "You're still doing it, treating everything like a battle where caring about anything means losing. But here's what you don't understand, Lucien. The reason you're facing this political attack has nothing to do with defending me. It has everything to do with the fact that you've spent years making powerful men fear you without giving them any reason to respect you beyond that fear. You built authority on intimidation alone. Now, they're testing whether that authority can survive when you show human reactions." She moved closer until they stood near enough that he could smell lavender from whatever soap she used. "Your father was wrong. Attachment doesn't make you weak, it makes you accountable. It gives you something worth protecting beyond just accumulating power for its own sake. But you're so convinced that caring equals vulnerability that you can't see the difference between love and stupidity." Lucien felt something dangerous rising in his chest, some combination of fury and desperation that made him want to either shake her or kiss her until that infuriating composure finally cracked. "You think I don't know I'm accountable? I'm responsible for thousands of people across Ravenscar lands. Every decision I make affects families who depend on this estate's stability. Getting emotionally compromised doesn't make me more capable of protecting them. It makes me easier to manipulate." "Then why did you defend me?" Seraphina asked simply. "If emotional reactions are such strategic suicide, why didn't you let Cedric's insult stand? You could have addressed it later through proper channels. Could have destroyed him financially or politically without public violence. But instead you nearly killed him in front of England's elite because someone said something cruel about your wife." The question hit like a blade, finding the gap in armor. Lucien had been avoiding examining his own motivations too closely because he knew what he'd find there. And that knowledge represented everything he'd spent his adult life running from. "I defended you because you're mine," he said roughly. "Because you wear my name and live under my protection and represent Ravenscar authority. Allowing insults to stand would have undermined everything I've built." Seraphina smiled sadly, the kind of expression that suggested she could see straight through bullshit he couldn't quite sell even to himself. "No, Lucien, you defended me because, in that moment, you forgot to be the untouchable duke and remembered you're a man who started caring about his wife, despite spending months trying to prevent exactly that. And now you're terrified because caring about me means I can hurt you in ways your enemies never could." She reached up and placed one hand against his chest, directly over his heart. He could feel his own pulse hammering beneath her palm. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to survive being married to someone so convinced that vulnerability equals death, that he'd rather be alone forever than risk letting anyone matter. But I can't keep doing this, Lucien. I can't keep living in a marriage where my husband treats me like a strategic asset he's obligated to maintain. Either you figure out how to be human again, or this arrangement becomes exactly the prison you've already turned it into. She withdrew her hand and stepped back, and the absence of her touch felt like losing something essential he couldn't name. Handle your political crisis however you need to. I'll play my role as Duchess perfectly, just like I always do, but I won't keep pretending that's enough anymore. Not for me. And not for you either, whether you're ready to admit it or not. Then she returned to her chambers and closed the door, leaving Lucien alone with truths he still didn't know how to process. He stood there until dawn light began creeping across the horizon, wrestling with realizations that felt like they were tearing him apart from the inside. Seraphina was right. About everything. He had defended her because she'd stopped being just a strategic necessity and become someone whose pain actually affected him. Someone whose presence had transformed his prison into something that almost felt like living instead of just surviving. And that terrified him more than any political threat ever could. Because if he admitted he loved her, he gave the world a weapon guaranteed to destroy him. But if he kept denying it, he'd lose her anyway. Not through enemies taking her away, but through her walking away from him by choice. For the first time in his adult life, Duke Lucien Ravenscar faced a problem he couldn't solve through intimidation or violence or political maneuvering. He could only solve it by becoming someone fundamentally different than the man his father had shaped him into. The question was whether he could change without destroying himself in the process. The next weeks brought political warfare that made the Masquerade incident look like friendly disagreement. Lord Winthrop's coalition expanded to include 6 noble houses, all carefully coordinating attacks designed to erode Ravenscar influence while maintaining plausible deniability about their coordination. They filed complaints about mining safety violations on Lucien's properties. They raised questions about his parliamentary voting patterns. They started rumors about financial irregularities and possible treason hidden in business dealings with French trading companies. None of it was true. All of it was effective, because truth mattered less than perception when you were trying to destroy someone's authority. Lucien responded with the strategic ruthlessness he'd spent decades perfecting. He called in favors from allies who owed him political debts. He deployed solicitors to systematically dismantle every accusation with documentation, proving his operations exceeded legal requirements. He had private investigators dig into the finances of every house attacking him, finding leverage he could use for counterpressure. But while he fought political battles in Westminster, Seraphina fought a different war inside Blackthorn Keep itself. She'd continued her unauthorized restoration of the estate's abandoned sections, but now her efforts expanded beyond just gardens. She reopened the Keep's library to tenant families, something that hadn't happened since his grandfather's time. She established a school in one of the unused wings, hiring teachers from London to educate children whose parents worked Ravenscar mines and farms. She used her own allowance to fund medical supplies for the estate doctor serving villages that had seen no healthcare improvements in 20 years. Every action directly contradicted the authoritarian efficiency Lucien had maintained for years. Every action also made the people living under Ravenscar authority genuinely loyal instead of just obedient through fear. The first time Lucien confronted her about these initiatives, she'd been reviewing supply ledgers in what had become her personal office, a converted parlor overlooking the restored gardens. "You're undermining established protocols," he said without preamble. "Estate management requires approval through proper channels. You can't just implement social programs because they feel good." Seraphina set down her pen and looked at him with that calm assessment that never failed to make him feel exposed. "I'm using resources you've been wasting for decades. The library was empty. The East Wing was abandoned. The medical supplies I purchased cost less than what you spend monthly on wine you never drink. And the results speak for themselves. Productivity increased across tenant farms because workers aren't watching their children die from preventable diseases. Seems like good management to me. That's not the point, and you know it. The point is, you're operating independently without coordinating through established authority structure. That creates confusion about who actually controls estate operations." Seraphina stood and moved around the desk to stand directly before him. She was tall for a woman, but still had to look up to meet his eyes. Yet somehow she never seemed smaller than him, even when physics dictated otherwise. "No, Lucien. What creates confusion is you treating people like resources to be managed instead of human beings depending on Ravenscar protection. You want absolute control? Fine. Control everything. Micromanage every decision down to which vegetables the cook purchases. But understand that control without purpose becomes tyranny. And tyranny only works until someone offers people something better. She placed documents on the desk behind her with deliberate precision. I'm offering them something better. Not revolution, not rebellion, just basic human dignity attached to Ravenscar authority. And you know what the really interesting thing is? It's making them more loyal to you, not less. Because they're starting to believe that maybe the Duke isn't just a ruthless bastard who sees them as disposable. Maybe he's someone who actually cares whether they survive. Lucien felt his hands curl into fists, not from desire to strike her, but from the sheer frustration of arguing with someone who kept being right in ways that invalidated everything he thought he understood about power. You're changing fundamental aspects of how this estate operates without permission, without consultation, without acknowledging that my authority supersedes your good intentions. Yes, Seraphina said simply. I am, and you're letting me do it because deep down you know I'm right. You know your father's methods kept people afraid but never actually earned their genuine loyalty. You know maintaining control through fear alone means constantly fighting to prevent rebellion instead of building something people want to protect. She moved closer, close enough that he could count individual eyelashes if he wanted to. You're at war with enemies who are using your reputation as a weapon against you. They're saying you're too ruthless, too unstable, too dangerous to maintain your current influence. And your instinct is to fight that perception by being even more ruthless. But what if you proved them wrong instead? What if you showed Parliament and every noble house in England that Ravenscar authority has evolved beyond just intimidation? That maybe the Duke of Ravenscar is capable of being both powerful and actually decent? It was manipulation. Elegant manipulation delivered with genuine conviction, but manipulation nonetheless. She was using his political crisis to push transformation she wanted, regardless of strategic considerations. And despite recognizing the tactics, Lucien found himself actually considering her argument, because she wasn't wrong about his reputation becoming a liability. Wasn't wrong that fighting his enemy's narrative by proving it accurate was strategic suicide. Maybe showing capacity for something beyond ruthlessness would undermine their attacks more effectively than counterattacking with greater ruthlessness. Or maybe he just wanted an excuse to stop being the person his father had turned him into. I won't publicly acknowledge weakness, he said carefully. Won't apologize for protecting Ravenscar interests. Won't transform into some reformed character who suddenly prioritizes sentiment over strategic necessity. Seraphina smiled, and for the first time since their wedding, the expression reached her eyes. I'm not asking you to become weak, Lucien. I'm asking you to become complete. There's a difference between acknowledging humanity and surrendering power. You can be the most formidable man in England and still care about something beyond just maintaining control. Those qualities aren't contradictory. They're complementary. She touched his hand briefly. A contact that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but somehow carried more intimacy than their entire wedding night. Let me help you. Not because I'm trying to manipulate you or control you or turn you into someone you're not, but because I'm your wife. And that's supposed to mean something beyond just political alliance. Let it mean partnership. Let it mean we face these threats together instead of you fighting alone while I wait to see if you survive. Lucien looked at her hand resting on his and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. Some wall he'd maintained since childhood, developing cracks too significant to repair. He'd spent 32 years believing that caring about anyone gave them power to destroy him. But standing here with his wife offering partnership instead of submission or betrayal, he started wondering if maybe the real destruction came from never allowing himself to care about anything at all. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. The gesture felt foreign and terrifying and necessary all at once. If we do this, he said quietly, if I actually let you into the strategic decisions instead of just managing household operations, you need to understand something fundamental. My enemies will target you specifically once they realize you matter to me. They'll use you as leverage. They'll threaten you to manipulate me. Every vulnerability I show becomes a weapon pointed directly at you. Seraphina squeezed his hand with surprising strength. Then we'll make sure I'm not vulnerable. Teach me what you know about political warfare. Show me how to recognize threats and counter them. Stop treating me like something fragile that needs protecting, and start treating me like an ally capable of defending herself. She stepped closer until they stood near enough that he could feel her breath against his jaw. I didn't survive my family's collapse by being weak, Lucien. I survived by being smart and ruthless when necessary. You married someone capable of matching you. So stop trying to keep me safely locked away and start figuring out what we could accomplish together. The kiss happened without conscious decision. One moment they were standing close enough to touch. The next moment his hands were tangled in her hair, and her back was pressed against the desk. And they were kissing with all the intensity of months of denied attraction finally reaching critical mass. It wasn't gentle, wasn't romantic in any conventional sense. It was desperate and consuming and felt like drowning and breathing simultaneously. Lucien kissed her like she was oxygen after suffocation, and Seraphina responded with matching hunger that suggested she'd been waiting for this just as long as he had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucien rested his forehead against hers while trying to remember how to form coherent thoughts. "This changes everything," he said roughly. "Yes," Seraphina agreed. "It does. So figure out how we survive it together, instead of you trying to survive it alone." And for the first time in his adult life, Duke Lucien Ravenscar decided that maybe letting someone matter was worth the risk of them destroying him, because living without her had started feeling more like death than actual dying ever could. The shift in their relationship didn't make his political problems disappear. If anything, it complicated them, because now Lucien was fighting for something beyond just maintaining authority. He was fighting to protect a future that included partnership instead of isolation. The attacks from Winthrop's coalition escalated throughout spring. They called for parliamentary hearings regarding Ravenscar business practices. They floated proposals to redistribute northern territories under the guise of improving administrative efficiency. They worked systematically to erode Lucien's influence through death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. But they miscalculated by assuming Lucien would respond predictably, that he'd fight with pure aggression and intimidation, giving them ammunition to paint him as the unstable tyrant their narrative required. Instead, Lucien opened Ravenscar records to independent auditors. He invited parliamentary committees to tour his mining operations and interview workers directly. He published financial statements proving his estate paid higher wages and maintained better safety standards than any comparable territory in England. And he did it all with Seraphina beside him, presenting a united front that confused enemies who'd expected isolation and defensiveness. The strategy worked because it forced his opponents to defend their own practices when comparison made them look exploitative by contrast. Within 6 weeks, 3 of the 6 houses in Winthrop's coalition quietly withdrew their complaints. 2 more agreed to private settlements that essentially meant paying Lucien to stop investigating their own questionable business methods. That left Lord Cedric Winthrop standing alone, too committed to retreat but lacking the political strength to continue meaningful assault. Lucien could have destroyed him completely at that point, could have used the leverage he'd accumulated to bankrupt the Winthrop estate and ruin Cedric's reputation permanently. His father would have done exactly that, eliminating threats so thoroughly they could never resurface. But Seraphina convinced him to show mercy instead. Not weakness, mercy. There was a difference she kept insisting he recognize. Let him survive but humiliated. She argued late one night in chambers they now genuinely shared. Show everyone that Ravenscar authority has evolved beyond just crushing enemies. Show them you're secure enough in your power that you don't need to destroy everyone who challenges you. It feels like leaving threats alive, Lucien said while pouring wine for both of them. Like creating future problems by not eliminating current ones. Seraphina accepted the wine and settled beside him near the fireplace that had witnessed so many confrontations between them. Or it demonstrates that you're confident enough in your position that minor challenges don't require total warfare. Cedric will spend the rest of his life knowing you could have destroyed him, but chose not to. That's a different kind of power than just being feared. That's being respected. And respect lasts longer than fear, because it doesn't require constant reinforcement through violence. Lucien studied her face in the firelight, this woman who'd transformed his fortress and his life through sheer stubborn refusal to accept his definitions of how power should work. "You're turning me into someone I don't recognize." "Good," Seraphina said with a slight smile. "The person you were before was powerful, but miserable. The person you're becoming might actually be happy occasionally. That seems like improvement." She set down her wine and moved to straddle his lap, her hands framing his face with unexpected tenderness. "I'm not trying to make you weak, Lucien. I'm trying to make you whole. There's a difference. You can be the most formidable man in England while also being someone capable of caring about your wife. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. They're both part of being actually human instead of just a title and reputation." He pulled her closer, burying his face against her neck and breathing in the scent of her perfume mixed with something uniquely her. "I spent my entire life learning that caring about people gave enemies weapons to use against me. Unlearning that feels like dismantling my own defenses without knowing if I'll survive what comes after. You'll survive because you won't be fighting alone anymore, Seraphina said quietly. That's what partnership means. We defend each other. We protect what we've built together. And yes, that makes us vulnerable in ways isolation never did. But it also makes us stronger than you ever were by yourself. She kissed him slowly, thoroughly, in a way that felt more like promise than passion. I love you, Lucien Ravenscar. I didn't plan to. Didn't want to, honestly. But somewhere between fighting with you and watching you struggle to become someone better than your father raised you to be, I fell in love with the man beneath all that armor. So stop fighting that like it's another enemy to defeat and just let yourself feel it. The words hit him with the force of physical impact. Nobody had said those words to him since his mother died. Nobody had looked at him the way Seraphina was looking at him now, with complete acceptance of who he was and who he was trying to become. The response came out rough and uncertain, like speaking a language he'd forgotten years ago. I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to love someone without it feeling like surrender or weakness or strategic suicide. Then learn, Seraphina said simply. Learn by doing it badly at first. Learn by making mistakes and trying again. Learn by trusting that I'm not going to use your feelings as a weapon against you. Just learn, Lucien, because I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this. So we figure it out together. And in that moment, Duke Lucien Ravenscar made a decision that felt more terrifying than any battlefield or political confrontation he'd ever faced. He chose to let himself be loved, and to love her back, even if it destroyed him. The season shifted toward summer, with Ravenscar Keep transformed in ways that went beyond just physical renovation. Servants smiled more often. Tenant families spoke of the Duke and Duchess with genuine affection instead of fearful respect. The estate had become something it never was during his father's reign, a place people wanted to serve rather than just feared disobeying, but political stability remained fragile. Winthrop's formal complaints had been withdrawn, but the damage to Lucien's reputation lingered. Rumors persisted that the Duke had become dangerously unpredictable, that his marriage had made him weak, that Ravenscar authority was declining because its Duke had lost the ruthless edge that made him formidable. Then everything changed because of a letter that arrived on a morning so ordinary, Lucien would later find its mundanity offensive. He was reviewing estate reports when Graves delivered correspondence marked with his father's old seal. Not the ducal crest. The personal seal the old Duke had used for private matters, he wanted kept absolutely confidential. Your Grace, this was discovered during archival organization. It appears to have been misfiled for several years. Lucien broke the seal and read words written in his father's distinctive handwriting. Words that had been waiting years to detonate like delayed explosives planted in the foundation of everything he believed. The letter explained in cold, clinical detail how the old Duke had systematically destroyed his wife's mental health through calculated emotional cruelty, how he'd isolated her from family and friends, how he'd used her love as a weapon to control her behavior, how he'd considered her death a convenient solution to the problem of her developing dangerous independence. But the truly devastating section came at the end. I write this so you understand the lesson completely, Lucien. Your mother's weakness was loving me despite having every reason not to. That vulnerability made her controllable. Remember this when you eventually marry. Love is a tool. Use it correctly, and you can shape people into whatever serves your interests. The woman fool enough to love you will be the woman you can control absolutely. Never forget that power. The paper trembled in Lucien's hands as he read the words a second time, then a third, feeling something fundamental crack open inside his chest. His father hadn't warned him about love being dangerous because enemies would exploit it. His father had taught him to fear love because he'd used it as a weapon himself, had tortured the woman who loved him as a method of control, had killed her through systematic emotional abuse, and then framed her death as a cautionary tale about attachment being weakness. Everything Lucien had believed about protecting himself from vulnerability was actually his father teaching him to become an abuser, to view love as something to exploit rather than something to reciprocate, to treat caring as a tactical advantage rather than a human connection. He'd spent 32 years building his identity around lessons designed to turn him into a monster, and he'd almost succeeded. The realization hit like physical trauma. Every interaction with Seraphina through that lens, every time he'd treated her like property instead of a person, every moment he'd prioritized control over connection, he'd been following his father's playbook without even recognizing it. The letter slipped from his hands and fluttered to the floor. Lucien sat there staring at nothing while his entire worldview collapsed around him. He found Seraphina in the garden she'd restored, kneeling in dirt while replanting something that required her full attention. She looked peaceful in a way that made his chest hurt. Beautiful in simple morning dress with dirt on her hands and sunlight in her hair. Completely unaware that her husband had just discovered he'd been trained to destroy exactly what she'd been offering him all along. She looked up as he approached and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "Lucien? What's wrong?" He couldn't speak, couldn't form words around the horror of understanding what he'd almost become. Instead, he held out the letter with a hand that wouldn't quite stop shaking. Seraphina read quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that looked like grief. When she finished, she set the paper aside carefully and stood to face him. "Your father was a monster," she said quietly, "and he tried to make you one too. But Lucien, you need to understand something critically important. You're not him. You never were. You fought against those teachings even when you didn't realize that's what you were doing. I defended you like property," Lucien said hoarsely. "Told you obedience was your purpose. Treated our marriage like ownership instead of partnership. I did exactly what this letter says. I used power to control you because that's what he taught me love actually was." Seraphina moved closer and placed both hands against his chest, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Yes. You did all of those things. And then you changed. You let me challenge you. You let me restore these gardens despite it making you uncomfortable. You defended me at the Masquerade, not because I was property, but because you'd started caring whether I was hurt. You're not your father, Lucien. You're a man who was given terrible lessons and then chose to unlearn them when someone showed you something better." The tears came without permission, something he hadn't allowed since childhood. Seraphina wrapped her arms around him while he shook with the kind of grief that came from understanding you'd been poisoned your entire life and only recently found the antidote. "I'm sorry," he said against her hair. "For every moment I made you feel like you didn't matter. For every time I prioritized control over caring about you. For bringing my father's legacy into our marriage like it was something worth preserving." "I know," Seraphina said softly, "and I forgive you. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because you recognized it was wrong and you're choosing to be different. That's what matters, Lucien. Not that you started from a damaged place, but that you're willing to do the work of becoming someone better." She pulled back enough to look at his face, her thumbs wiping away tears he hadn't realized were still falling. "So here's what we do now. We burn that letter. We let your father stay dead instead of letting his poison keep infecting you. And we build something completely different than what he taught you was possible. We build a marriage based on actual partnership, on mutual respect, on love that isn't a weapon, but a foundation." She kissed him gently, carefully, like he was something precious that required delicate handling. "You're not broken, Lucy. And you're just finally healing from damage you didn't choose. So let me help you heal. Let me love you even when you don't feel like you deserve it. And eventually, you'll understand that love was never the enemy. Your father was." They stood there as the garden surrounded by things she'd grown while he held on to her, like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning. And for the first time in his life, Duke Lucien Ravenscar understood that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was courage. But understanding that truth and surviving it were different things entirely. Because the moment he let himself love Seraphina completely was the same moment he gave the world a weapon guaranteed to destroy him. And somewhere in the shadows of England's political landscape, his enemies were already learning how to use it. The summer passed with a deceptive peace that should have warned Lucien something catastrophic was building beneath the surface. Blackthorn Keep thrived under their combined leadership. Parliament had stopped its investigations. The noble houses that had challenged Ravenscar authority now sought alliances instead of confrontation. Even Lord Winthrop had retreated to his estate with the humiliated silence of a man who'd tested boundaries and lost decisively. Everything appeared stable, which meant Lucien had missed something critical. He realized his mistake on an August morning when Graves entered his study carrying documents that made the old steward's hand shake visibly. In 30 years of service, Lucien had never seen Graves display physical fear. The sight triggered every combat instinct he'd spent years honing. "Your Grace," Graves said with a voice that barely maintained professional control. "These arrived via private courier. The messenger indicated they were duplicates. The originals have been delivered to Westminster." Lucien took the documents and felt the ground shift beneath him as he scanned contents that transformed political stability into existential threat. Financial records, business correspondence, private communications, all of it proving systematic violations of parliamentary law regarding foreign trade, tax obligations, and mineral rights exploitation. None of it was fabricated. Every page documented actual transactions from Ravenscar business operations over the past decade. Transactions that were legal when they occurred but had been rendered retroactively criminal by legislation passed 2 years ago. Legislation Lucien had opposed precisely because it would criminalize standard practices across English nobility. Someone had compiled years of financial records and weaponized them through legal technicalities. Someone with access to documents that should have been secured in vaults only Lucien himself could open. Someone who understood Ravenscar operations intimately enough to identify which specific transactions would cause maximum legal damage. The betrayal wasn't coming from outside enemies. It was coming from inside his own organization. Lucien read through every page with mechanical precision while his mind cataloged who had access to these records. His solicitors, his estate managers, his financial advisors, and Graves himself, who managed the household and coordinated with everyone handling Ravenscar business matters. He looked up at the steward who'd served 3 generations of his family and saw something in the old man's eyes that confirmed his worst suspicions. "How long?" Lucien asked quietly. "How long have you been selling information to my enemies?" Graves didn't attempt denial. The confession came out with the exhausted relief of a man who'd been carrying unbearable weight for too long. 3 years, Your Grace, since your father's death. Lord Winthrop approached me with evidence that my grandson had committed fraud in his position at a London bank. He offered to make the charges disappear if I provided occasional information about Ravenscar operations. Small things at first, guest lists for social functions, travel schedules, nothing that seemed significant. The old man's voice cracked, but he continued with the determination of someone confessing before execution. Then he started asking for financial records, business correspondence, documents I knew could be used as weapons against you. I refused initially, but he showed me what my grandson would face: prison, ruin, complete destruction of his future. So I gave him what he wanted because I'm a coward who chose family over duty. Lucien stood and moved around the desk with predatory focus. Every lesson his father had taught about eliminating threats efficiently echoed in his head. Graves had committed treason, had endangered everything Ravenscar represented, had chosen his own family's welfare over absolute loyalty to the duke he served. The old Lucien would have had him arrested immediately, would have ensured both Graves and his grandson faced maximum legal consequences as a message to anyone who considered betrayal, would have eliminated the threat completely before it could metastasize further. But he wasn't entirely that man anymore. Seraphina had changed him in ways he was still learning to understand. So, instead of immediate violence, he asked a question that would have been weakness 6 months ago. Why tell me now? Why confess after successfully hiding this for 3 years? Because they're targeting the duchess, Graves said with genuine anguish. The next phase of Winthrop's plan involves using these financial documents to force your arrest on charges of treason and tax fraud. While you're detained and stripped of authority, they intend to pressure Duchess Seraphina into signing papers that would transfer portions of Ravenscar territory to parliamentary oversight. They believe she'll cooperate to secure your release. His hands clenched into fists that trembled with age and emotion. I betrayed you to protect my family. I can live with that guilt, but I won't participate in plans that endanger the Duchess. She's shown more genuine care for the people of this estate in 6 months than your father demonstrated in 40 years. She doesn't deserve to be used as leverage against you because of my cowardice. The confession hung between them like smoke after cannon fire. Lucien processed information with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through decades of political warfare. Graves had betrayed him, but the betrayal stemmed from understandable human weakness rather than malicious ambition. And the old steward was confessing now specifically to protect Seraphina, which suggested loyalty could be redirected even after breaking. The decision came with brutal clarity. He couldn't afford mercy, but he couldn't afford losing Graves's cooperation either. Not when the real threat was Winthrop's coordinated assault rather than one old man's compromised loyalty. You're going to help me destroy them, Lucien said flatly. You're going to continue providing information to Winthrop exactly as you have been. But from this moment forward, everything you give him will be carefully constructed. Intelligence designed to make him believe he's winning while actually walking into a trap. He moved close enough that Graves had to look up to meet his eyes. Your grandson will face consequences after this is over. Not prison, but he'll never work in finance again, and you'll both understand that Ravenscar mercy comes with permanent oversight. But right now, I need you functional and committed to fixing what you've broken. Can you do that? Or do I need to find someone else to play double agent while you rot in a cell? Graves straightened with something resembling his old dignity returning to his posture. I can do it, Your Grace. Tell me what you need. The strategy came together with the lethal efficiency of someone who'd spent his life preparing for exactly this kind of warfare. Lucien couldn't prevent the documents from reaching Parliament. They were already in motion, but he could control the narrative around them, could shape how they were presented, could ensure that when the accusations came, he had counter-evidence ready that would expose the conspiracy attempting to destroy him. But first, he needed to protect Seraphina, because everything Graves had revealed confirmed Lucien's deepest fear. The moment he'd allowed himself to love his wife was the moment he'd given his enemies the perfect weapon to use against him. He found her in the library, where afternoon light streamed through windows she'd had restored to their original clarity. She was reviewing correspondence with one of the tenant school teachers, her face animated with genuine engagement in a way that made his chest tighten painfully. She looked happy, fulfilled, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse around them. Seraphina, he said quietly, we need to talk, now. She recognized the tone immediately and dismissed the teacher with gracious efficiency before turning to face him with concern, replacing her earlier warmth. What happened? Lucien handed her the documents without preamble. She read quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm to cold fury that matched his own. When she finished, she set the papers down with deliberate control. How bad is this? Bad enough to force my arrest and possible execution if I can't prove the charges are politically motivated. Bad enough that Winthrop is planning to use you as leverage to force territorial concessions while I'm detained. Bad enough that everything we've built is at risk. He moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel her presence without quite touching. I'm sending you to London. Today. You'll stay with my solicitors under guard until this situation resolves. Winthrop can't use you as leverage if you're not accessible. Seraphina turned to face him with an expression that would have made lesser men reconsider their assumptions. No. The single word carried absolute finality. Lucien felt frustration spike through his carefully maintained control. This isn't negotiable, Seraphina. You're in danger specifically because these people know you matter to me. The safest thing for both of us is getting you away from Blackthorn Keep until I can eliminate the threat. She moved closer until they stood near enough that he could see gold flecks in her brown eyes. Let me explain something you apparently still haven't learned, Lucien. I didn't marry you to become someone you protect by hiding away when things get dangerous. I married you to be your partner. That means I stay and we fight this together, or your enemies have already won by forcing you back into isolation. You don't understand what these men are capable of. They'll use you against me in ways you can't defend yourself from. Then teach me, Seraphina said with steel in her voice. Teach me how to recognize their tactics. Teach me how to counter them. But don't insult me by assuming I'm helpless just because I'm not trained in your particular brand of warfare. I survived my family's financial collapse. I survived 6 months of marriage to the most emotionally unavailable man in England. I think I can handle some aristocratic conspiracy. She placed both hands on his chest and looked up with eyes that held no fear despite the genuine danger they faced. You're doing it again. Retreating to old patterns where you protect yourself by isolating everyone who matters. But that's exactly what they want. They want you alone and defensive and making decisions from fear instead of strategy. So stop trying to send me away and start figuring out how we win this fight together. The words hit him like they always did when Seraphina refused to accept limitations he tried imposing for her protection. She was right. Sending her away would be tactical retreat that accomplished nothing except confirming to his enemies that she was his weakness. Better to keep her close where he could actually protect her while using their partnership as a strength rather than a vulnerability. Fine, he said roughly. You stay. But you follow my instructions regarding security without argument. You don't go anywhere alone. You don't meet with anyone I haven't vetted personally. And if I tell you to leave at any point, you leave immediately without stopping to debate strategy. Seraphina smiled slightly despite the severity of their situation. I can agree to reasonable security precautions. Now tell me everything so we can start planning how to destroy these people before they destroy us. They spent the next 3 hours reviewing every detail of Winthrop's conspiracy. Graves provided additional information about communication channels and coordination between the noble houses involved. Lucien's solicitors arrived from London with legal analysis of the charges and potential defenses. His network of informants supplied intelligence about parliamentary sentiment and which representatives might be sympathetic versus hostile. By evening, they had assembled a counter-strategy that would either save Ravenscar authority or guarantee their complete destruction. There was no middle ground, no possibility of negotiated settlement. This was total warfare where only one side would survive intact. The formal charges arrived 2 days later via parliamentary messenger, accompanied by bailiffs authorized to place Duke Lucien Ravenscar under house arrest pending investigation. The humiliation was intentional. They could have summoned him to Westminster for questioning. Instead, they treated him like a common criminal who required immediate detention. Lucien submitted to the arrest with perfect composure while internally calculating how to turn this public degradation into tactical advantage. His solicitors immediately filed appeals and demanded expedited hearings. His parliamentary allies began organizing defensive coalitions. His financial auditors started preparing documentation that would prove the charges resulted from retroactive legal interpretation rather than actual criminal intent. But while legal and political machinery ground into motion, Winthrop made his move against Seraphina exactly as Graves had warned. She was reviewing estate accounts in her study when a servant announced visitors. Lord Winthrop himself, along with 2 other nobles from houses that had participated in the conspiracy. They entered without invitation and dismissed the servant with arrogant authority. "Duchess," Winthrop said with false courtesy that didn't mask predatory calculation beneath, "I'm certain you're aware of your husband's current legal difficulties. I'm here to offer assistance." Seraphina set down her pen and regarded the 3 men with the cool assessment Lucien had taught her during their strategy sessions. She'd prepared for this encounter, had rehearsed responses designed to extract information while revealing nothing about their defensive preparations. "How generous," she said with perfectly modulated warmth. "Please explain what assistance you believe appropriate, given that my husband faces charges." "Your coalition specifically engineered." The directness caught Winthrop off balance for a moment before he recovered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The charges are unfortunately necessary to address systematic violations of parliamentary law. However, certain accommodations could be arranged if you were willing to cooperate regarding territorial administration during the investigation period." He produced documents from an inner pocket and placed them on her desk. "Simply sign these papers temporarily transferring oversight of Northern Ravenscar holdings to parliamentary supervision. Once your husband's legal matters are resolved satisfactorily, full control would be restored. Your cooperation would demonstrate good faith and likely result in reduced charges." Seraphina picked up the documents and read through them with the careful attention Lucien had taught her to apply to any contract. The terms were exactly as predicted. They weren't asking for temporary oversight. They were engineering permanent territorial seizure disguised as administrative cooperation. She set the papers down and looked at Winthrop with an expression of such withering contempt that the man actually took a step backward. "You must think I'm spectacularly stupid. These documents don't create temporary oversight. They permanently transfer mineral rights and administrative authority to parliamentary committees you control personally. You're not offering assistance. You're attempting extortion while my husband is detained and unable to interfere directly." She stood and moved around the desk with the kind of predatory grace she'd learned from watching Lucien dominate rooms through pure presence. "Here's what's actually going to happen. You're going to leave my home immediately. You're going to withdraw these fraudulent charges before my husband's solicitors finish assembling evidence that will expose your conspiracy to every member of Parliament. And you're going to pray that Duke Ravenscar's current legal difficulties prevent him from pursuing you personally, because if he regains full authority before you've retreated completely, there won't be enough of your family name left to fill a footnote in history books." Winthrop's false courtesy evaporated into ugly rage. "You're making a serious mistake, Duchess. Your husband will be convicted of treason. His lands will be seized, his title will be stripped, and you'll be left with nothing except whatever mercy we choose to show. Sign the papers now and at least preserve something from this disaster." One of his companions moved closer in a poorly disguised attempt at physical intimidation. Seraphina held her ground without visible fear, even though 3 men now stood between her and the door. "Get out," she said quietly, "before I have guards remove you by force and file charges for trespassing and attempted coercion." Winthrop leaned closer with the kind of cruel confidence men displayed when they believed they held all advantages. There are no guards coming, Duchess. We made certain your security was occupied elsewhere before this meeting. You're alone with 3 men who've already decided your husband's cooperation is optional. We can obtain your signature through persuasion, or we can obtain it through significantly less pleasant methods. Your choice. The threat hung in the air like drawn steel. For the first time since they'd entered, genuine fear flickered across Seraphina's face. But beneath the fear was cold calculation. She'd prepared for this exact scenario during strategy sessions with Lucien, had insisted they plan for worst-case possibilities rather than assuming civilized boundaries would hold. Her hand moved to the desk drawer where she'd stored the pistol Lucien had given her 2 days ago. She pulled it out with steady hands and aimed directly at Winthrop's chest from a distance of maybe 4 feet. Close enough that even minimal training would guarantee a lethal shot. The men froze. Winthrop's confidence evaporated into shocked disbelief. "I asked you to leave," Seraphina said with a voice that had gone cold as winter frost. "I'm now telling you. Walk out of this room immediately or I'll shoot you for attempted assault. And before you calculate whether I'm serious, understand that my husband spent 2 days teaching me exactly how to use this weapon. He was very thorough about ensuring I could defend myself against men who mistake isolation for vulnerability." She cocked the hammer with deliberate precision that suggested she absolutely knew how to follow through on the threat. "Move." The 3 men retreated toward the door with the awkward haste of people who'd badly miscalculated their opponent's capabilities. Winthrop paused in the doorway with fury twisting his aristocratic features into something ugly. "You'll regret this, Duchess. When your husband is convicted and stripped of everything, remember, you could have prevented it by cooperating." "No," Seraphina said while maintaining her aim. "When you're exposed and ruined, remember, you could have prevented it by accepting that Ravenscar authority doesn't collapse just because you managed to engineer legal harassment. Now get out before I decide that defending myself requires making sure you can't threaten me again." The men fled. Seraphina waited until their footsteps faded completely before lowering the pistol with hands that had started trembling from adrenaline she'd suppressed during the confrontation. She set the weapon down carefully and then had to grip the desk edge to stay standing as delayed fear finally caught up with her nervous system. That was the moment Lucien appeared in the doorway. He'd been listening from the adjoining room the entire time, ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond Seraphina's ability to control it. But she'd handled this confrontation perfectly, had recognized the threat, had responded decisively, had protected herself without requiring his rescue. Pride and terror warred in his chest as he watched his wife process what had just happened. Pride because she'd proven herself capable of defending against threats he couldn't always prevent. Terror because the confrontation confirmed his enemies were willing to use violence against her to achieve their objectives. "You were right," he said quietly. "Sending you away would have accomplished nothing except making you vulnerable somewhere I couldn't reach. At least here you're armed, and I can actually protect you." Seraphina looked at him with eyes that held shock and determination in equal measure. "They were going to force my signature, Lucien. If I hadn't been armed, they would have used physical violence to make me cooperate. These aren't civilized aristocrats playing political games. These are men willing to commit actual crimes to destroy you." She moved toward him, and he caught her in his arms while she finally allowed herself to shake with the fear she'd suppressed during the confrontation. "I need you to promise me something," she said against his chest. "Promise that when we destroy them completely. No mercy, no half measures. These men threaten me personally. That means they don't get to walk away with comfortable exile or social embarrassment. They get annihilated." Lucien felt something dark and satisfied settle into his bones at hearing his wife demand the same ruthless justice he'd been planning since discovering the betrayal. She wasn't asking him to show mercy anymore. She was asking him to be the weapon his father had forged him into. But this time, he'd be using that capability to protect something worth protecting rather than just maintaining power for its own sake. "I promise," he said quietly. "They targeted you. That means they signed their own death warrants. I'm just going to deliver the execution." The hearing happened 3 weeks later in a parliamentary chamber packed with nobility who'd come to witness either Ravenscar's vindication or destruction. Lucien stood before the assembled representatives with perfect composure despite weeks of house arrest and systematic character assassination in London newspapers. The prosecution presented their evidence with polished efficiency. Financial documents proving Ravenscar violations of trade regulations. Business correspondence demonstrating systematic tax avoidance. Communications suggesting possible treason through unauthorized negotiations with French commercial interests. All of it was technically accurate, All of it had been legal when it occurred, but presented through careful framing, it appeared damning. Then Lucien's solicitors presented their defense, not by disputing the accuracy of the prosecution's evidence, but by systematically proving that every transaction in question was standard practice across English nobility at the time, that the legislation being used to prosecute these actions had been intentionally written to be retroactive, that Lucien had opposed that legislation specifically because he recognized it as a weapon that could be used against anyone who'd ever conducted normal business operations. They produced records showing that Lord Winthrop himself had conducted identical transactions, that the other houses in his coalition had engaged in the same practices, that prosecuting Lucien while ignoring widespread identical behavior by his accusers demonstrated this wasn't about legal violations. It was about political targeting. But the true devastation came when Graves testified. The old steward walked into the chamber with the exhausted dignity of someone who'd already accepted his fate. He confessed everything. 3 years of providing confidential information to Winthrop, the blackmail that forced his cooperation, the systematic betrayal of Ravenscar Trust, and then he revealed that for the past 3 weeks, every piece of information he'd given Winthrop had been carefully constructed intelligence designed to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. He provided documented evidence of coordination between Winthrop and corrupt parliamentary representatives, communications proving they'd planned to use fabricated charges to force territorial seizure, written instructions regarding how to coerce Duchess Seraphina into signing documents under duress. The chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives shouted accusations. Winthrop's allies attempted to flee. The presiding magistrate called for order while legal observers frantically took notes on proceedings that would become legendary in parliamentary history. When silence finally returned, the magistrate looked at Winthrop with an expression of absolute disgust. Lord Winthrop, you and your co-conspirators stand accused of conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted extortion, and criminal conspiracy to deprive a peer of lawful property through false prosecution. Duke Ravenscar, all charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm recommending immediate criminal investigation into everyone involved in this conspiracy. The magistrate's gaze swept across the chamber with cold authority. This assembly has been used as a weapon to settle personal vendettas and engineer property theft. That ends today. Anyone who participated in this scheme will face full legal consequences. England's nobility is not above the law, and this chamber will not be used for criminal purposes. Lucien watched Winthrop's face drain of color as the man realized he'd been outmaneuvered completely. Every trap he'd set had been turned back against him. Every weapon he'd prepared had been taken away. He'd gambled everything on destroying Ravenscar and lost catastrophically. But Lucien felt no satisfaction in the victory, because standing in that chamber, surrounded by representatives who'd watched his character be systematically demolished before his vindication, he understood something that made his blood run cold. They'd won this battle. The conspiracy had been exposed and his enemies faced ruin. But the fact that the attempt had come so close to succeeding proved a terrible truth. His father had been right about one thing. The moment you loved something, you gave the world a weapon to destroy you. Winthrop had recognized that Seraphina mattered to Lucien and immediately targeted her as the most efficient path to Ravenscar's destruction. And it had nearly worked. If Seraphina hadn't been armed, if Graves hadn't confessed, if any of a dozen variables had shifted slightly, Lucien would be facing execution while his wife was coerced into surrendering everything they'd built together. Love didn't make you stronger. It just gave you more to lose. And losing had become infinitely more terrifying now that he had someone worth losing. The thought followed him back to Blackthorn Keep, where Seraphina waited in the entrance hall. She ran to him the moment his carriage stopped, and he caught her in his arms while servants applauded their duke's vindication. They held each other like survivors of some catastrophic storm, both understanding how close they'd come to complete destruction. "It's over," Seraphina said against his chest. "We won. They're destroyed, and we survived." But Lucien couldn't share her relief, because standing there holding his wife while servants celebrated around them, he'd realized something that felt like drowning on dry land. They'd survived this conspiracy. But there would be others. More enemies. More threats. More people who'd recognized that Duke Lucien Ravenscar had finally developed a vulnerability they could exploit. And next time he might not be able to protect her. Next time the weapons aimed at him might hit her instead. He could choose absolute ruthlessness and survive. Or he could choose love and spend the rest of his life terrified that caring about someone would get them both killed. His father's voice echoed from childhood lessons with the clarity of recent conversation. Love is weakness that enemies exploit. Attachment is surrender that guarantees destruction. You'll learn this lesson eventually, Lucien, either by watching someone you love get destroyed or by destroying them yourself to protect them from worse fates. Standing in the entrance of Blackthorn Keep, surrounded by celebration he couldn't feel, Duke Lucien Ravenscar faced a truth more horrifying than any conspiracy or political threat. He'd spent months learning to love his wife. Now he had to figure out if keeping her alive meant pushing her away completely before his enemies recognized they could destroy him by simply destroying her. The thought felt like tearing his own heart out while it was still beating. But his father had been preparing him for this exact moment his entire life. And maybe the old monster had been right all along about what survival actually required. The victory celebration lasted exactly one night before Lucien started pulling away. Seraphina noticed it immediately because she'd spent 6 months learning to read the man beneath the armor he wore like a second skin. The distance returned in small increments that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know him intimately. He stopped sleeping in their shared chambers, claiming estate business required late hours in his study. He attended meals but contributed minimal conversation. He touched her less, and when he did, the contact felt mechanical rather than genuine. She gave him 3 days before confronting him in the study, where he'd been reviewing financial reports at 2 a.m, like a man trying to exhaust himself into unconsciousness. "You're doing it again," she said from the doorway. "Retreating into isolation because something scared you badly enough to make you question whether vulnerability is worth surviving." Lucien didn't look up from the document spread across his desk. His voice came out flat and controlled in the way that meant he was working hard to suppress genuine emotion underneath. "I'm ensuring the estate recovers from 3 weeks of administrative disruption caused by false imprisonment. That requires focus and long hours. Nothing more complicated than responsibility." Seraphina moved into the study and closed the door behind her with deliberate finality. She'd prepared for this conversation during the sleepless night she'd spent alone, wondering when her husband would stop running from the truth they both knew. "Don't lie to me, Lucien. You're not working late because of administrative necessity. You're avoiding me because Winthrop's conspiracy proved that loving me makes you vulnerable in ways you can't control. And that terrifies you more than any political threat ever could." She stood on the opposite side of his desk and waited until he finally looked up and met her eyes. What she saw there made her chest tighten painfully. He looked haunted, exhausted, like a man being torn apart by competing instincts that couldn't coexist peacefully. "They targeted you because I care about you," he said quietly. "They recognize that you matter to me and immediately weaponized that knowledge. If you hadn't been armed, if Graves hadn't confessed, if any variable had shifted slightly, they would have used you to destroy everything I've built. And next time, I might not be able to protect you." His hands clenched into fists on the desk surface. "My father warned me about this my entire life. Attachment creates vulnerability. Love gives enemies weapons they can use to break you completely. I spent months unlearning those lessons because you convinced me that caring about someone didn't equal weakness. But Winthrop proved my father was right. The moment I allowed myself to love you was the moment I gave the world a target guaranteed to destroy me." Seraphina felt fury and heartbreak warring in her chest. She'd known this conversation was coming, had anticipated every argument Lucien would use to justify pushing her away. But hearing him actually voice the intent to retreat from their marriage felt like being stabbed with words sharpened specifically to cause maximum damage. "So what's your solution?" she asked with dangerous calm. "Push me away before the next enemy recognizes I matter to you? Turn our marriage back into the empty arrangement it was before we both admitted this was real? Prove your father was right by becoming exactly the isolated monster he tried to create?" "I'm trying to keep you alive," Lucien said roughly. "Every enemy I've made over 32 years of accumulating power is now calculating how to use you against me. The safest thing for you is if I make it publicly clear that you're not actually important to me, that our marriage is exactly the political arrangement everyone assumed it was, that threatening you accomplishes nothing except wasting their resources." He stood and moved to the windows overlooking Ravenscar territory, lit by moonlight that made everything look cold and distant. "I can protect you if you're just my wife in legal terms. I can't protect you if you're the person I love more than anything else in my life, because that knowledge turns you into a walking target for everyone who wants to destroy me." The confession hung between them like broken glass. Seraphina felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd survived too much to break down now, over a man who couldn't see that his father's lessons were poison, designed to ensure his son would die alone and miserable. "You're a coward," she said quietly. "Not because you're afraid of enemies, but because you're so terrified of losing me that you'd rather push me away yourself than risk someone else taking me from you. You'd rather destroy what we have on your own terms than give the world a chance to destroy it first." She moved closer until they stood near enough that she could see his reflection in the window glass, overlapping with her own, like ghosts haunting the same space. "Your father was wrong, Lucien. Not about love creating vulnerability. He was right about that. Love absolutely makes you vulnerable. But he was wrong about vulnerability being weakness. Because the strongest thing any person can do is care about something, despite knowing it could destroy them. That's not surrender. That's courage. And you're choosing cowardice instead because it feels safer than risking the pain of actually losing someone you love." Lucien turned to face her with eyes that held anguish he could no longer completely hide. "You don't understand what it feels like knowing that my enemies could torture you to make me surrender everything. Could hurt you in ways I can't prevent just to prove they can reach me through you. I've spent my entire life making sure nothing could touch me. Now you're asking me to accept that the thing I care about most is completely exposed to threats I can't always counter. Then teach me how to defend myself better," Seraphina said with steel in her voice. "Give me weapons. Give me training. Give me the tools to be something more than just a vulnerability. But don't you dare push me away because you're too scared to risk loving someone who might get hurt. That's not protection. That's abandonment disguised as strategy." She placed one hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat hammering beneath her palm. "I didn't sign up for safe when I married you. I signed up for real, for partnership, for someone who'd stop treating emotions like tactical liabilities and start recognizing that caring about each other is what makes any of this worth surviving. So either you figure out how to be brave enough to love me despite the risks, or you prove your father succeeded in turning you into exactly the empty monster he wanted you to become." Lucien caught her wrist and pulled her close enough that she could feel the tremor running through his frame. When he spoke, his voice came out raw and desperate. "I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to love you and still function as the Duke who has to make ruthless decisions that keep thousands of people protected. Don't know how to be both the man you need and the weapon this territory requires. Then learn," Seraphina said simply. "Learn by trying and failing and trying again. Learn by trusting that I'm strong enough to handle whatever comes at us. Learn by accepting that vulnerability isn't weakness when it's chosen deliberately. Just learn, Lucien, because I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this. So we figure it out together, or we both lose everything that matters." The kiss happened with the desperation of two people clinging to each other while the world tried to tear them apart. Lucien held her like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning, and Seraphina kissed him back with all the fierce determination of someone refusing to let fear win. They stood there in the study, surrounded by financial reports and moonlight, until Lucien finally pulled back enough to rest his forehead against hers. "If anything happens to you because of me," he said hoarsely, "I won't survive it. Not the political consequences, the personal ones. I'll become exactly what my father was. Maybe worse." "Then we make sure nothing happens," Seraphina said quietly. "We fight together. We protect each other. And we prove that love isn't the weakness your father convinced you it was. It's the thing worth fighting for when everything else becomes meaningless." And for the first time since the conspiracy's exposure, Lucien allowed himself to believe that maybe surviving his father's legacy didn't require becoming his father. Maybe it required becoming someone completely different. Someone brave enough to love, despite knowing exactly how much it would hurt to lose. But belief and reality were different things. And reality was about to teach both of them exactly how high the cost of love could climb. The attack came 2 weeks later during the autumn equinox celebration at Blackthorn Keep. Every noble family within 50 miles had been invited to the annual gathering, a tradition the Ravenscars had maintained for 3 generations. It was supposed to be a display of renewed strength after the conspiracy's collapse, a demonstration that Ravenscar authority had emerged from legal assault even more formidable than before. Instead, it became the battlefield where every lesson Lucien had learned about power and vulnerability converged into lethal confrontation. The evening began exactly as planned. Nobles arrived in expensive carriages wearing formal attire and false smiles. Musicians played in the great hall while servants circulated with wine and elaborate appetizers. Seraphina moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her midnight blue gown making her look like royalty as she charmed visiting dignitaries and diffused political tensions with diplomatic skill. Lucien watched her from across the hall and felt that now familiar combination of pride and terror. She was magnificent in her element, transforming social functions into strategic opportunities. But every moment she spent visible and accessible was a moment enemies could identify her as a target worth exploiting. He'd positioned guards throughout the keep, had vetted every guest personally, had taken every security precaution his experience could anticipate. But paranoia whispered that preparation was never enough, when the stakes included protecting someone who'd become more important than survival itself. The first indication of trouble came when Graves approached with barely concealed urgency beneath his professional composure. "Your Grace, we have a situation developing in the East Wing. Several guests have congregated in areas they shouldn't be accessing. Security is investigating, but I thought you should know immediately." Lucien felt combat instincts activate with the clarity that came from decades of survival training. Guests wandering into restricted areas could be innocent mistakes or deliberate reconnaissance. Either way, it required his personal attention. He caught Seraphina's eye across the crowded hall and gestured toward Graves. She acknowledged with a subtle nod, understanding immediately that something was wrong. They'd developed nonverbal communication during the past weeks, a language of glances and gestures that let them coordinate without alerting observers to potential threats. Lucien moved toward the East Wing with Graves while his mind cataloged who was attending tonight and which ones had connections to Winthrop's disgraced coalition. The conspiracy had been exposed, but not all its participants had faced consequences yet. Some had managed to distance themselves from Winthrop before the full collapse. Some were still being investigated. Any of them could be planning retaliation. The East Wing housed his private study and the family vault containing documents and valuables accumulated over generations. If someone was attempting to access those areas during a social function, it wasn't accidental tourism. It was coordinated assault using the celebration as cover. He found 3 men in the corridor outside his study. Not nobles, hired muscle, dressed in servant's livery, but carrying themselves with the particular awareness that came from military training. The moment they saw Lucien approaching, their hands moved toward weapons concealed beneath formal clothing. That was the moment everything exploded into violence. One man drew a blade and lunged with professional efficiency. Lucien sidestepped and drove his elbow into the attacker's throat hard enough to crush the windpipe. The man collapsed choking while Lucien spun to engage the second attacker, already closing distance with a knife aimed at ducal kidneys. Combat became instinct refined through years of training his father had insisted upon. Lucien blocked the knife thrust and broke the man's wrist with a sharp twist that made bones crack audibly. Then he drove his knee into the attacker's face with enough force to shatter his nose and send him sprawling unconscious against the wall. The third man had drawn a pistol, but hesitated, clearly not expecting the Duke of Ravenscar to fight with the lethal efficiency of a trained killer. That hesitation cost him everything. Lucien crossed the distance before the man could fire and disarmed him with brutal effectiveness, then slammed him against the corridor wall hard enough to crack plaster. "Who sent you?" Lucien demanded while his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Who's coordinating this attack?" The man just smiled with blood-stained teeth and said nothing. Professional silence bought with either loyalty or fear of consequences worse than whatever Lucien could inflict. But the attack itself confirmed what Lucien had dreaded since the conspiracy's exposure. His enemies hadn't given up. They just changed tactics from legal warfare to direct assault. And if they were attacking in the East Wing, that meant the celebration in the Great Hall was either a distraction or a separate target, which meant Seraphina was in immediate danger, surrounded by hundreds of guests who could include additional threats he hadn't identified. Lucien released the unconscious attacker and ran back toward the Great Hall while his mind calculated worst-case scenarios with horrifying clarity. If this was coordinated assault rather than opportunistic theft, they'd planned for multiple targets. The study was one, the vault was another. And Seraphina represented the most valuable target of all because taking her would give enemies leverage nothing else could provide. He burst into the Great Hall to find chaos already erupting. Screaming guests fled in multiple directions while more disguised attackers moved through the crowd with coordinated precision. They weren't targeting random nobles. They were creating panic while a smaller group pushed toward where Seraphina had been standing moments earlier. Lucien spotted her near the far wall, surrounded by 4 men who'd drawn weapons and were attempting to force her toward a side exit. She was fighting back with desperate energy, using the pistol training he'd given her to keep them at distance. But she was outnumbered, and the attackers were professionals who'd clearly planned this extraction carefully. Everything Lucien had feared was happening in real time. His enemies had recognized that destroying him directly was impossible. So they were taking the person who mattered most and using her as leverage to force his surrender of everything he'd built. Raw fury ignited in his chest with the kind of intensity that made rational thought secondary to pure protective instinct. These men had entered his home, had threatened his people, had dared to put their hands on his wife. And they were about to learn why 3 generations of Ravenscars had ruled northern England through a reputation for absolute ruthlessness when defending what belonged to them. Lucien moved through the panicked crowd like violence given human form. He grabbed a ceremonial sword from a wall display and crossed the hall in seconds that felt like hours. The first attacker near Seraphina died before realizing the Duke had arrived. Lucien's blade went through his back and out his chest with surgical precision. The second attacker turned to engage and lost his head in a single stroke that sprayed blood across marble floors guests had been dancing on minutes earlier. The remaining 2 attackers recognized they'd miscalculated catastrophically. They attempted to retreat while dragging Seraphina with them, but she twisted free and put a bullet through one man's knee with the kind of cold accuracy that proved she'd been paying attention during weapons training. He collapsed screaming while his companion abandoned the mission entirely and ran for the nearest exit. Lucien let him go. He'd deal with tracking down survivors later. Right now his only priority was reaching Seraphina and ensuring she was unharmed. She stood trembling with the pistol still aimed at threats that no longer existed. Her midnight blue gown was torn and spattered with blood. Her carefully arranged hair had come loose. She looked like a duchess who'd just survived combat rather than attended a social function. But she was alive, breathing, still standing despite everything that had just happened. Lucien caught her in his arms and held her while his own hand shook with adrenaline and fear he'd been suppressing through pure necessity. The great hall around them was a disaster of fleeing guests, wounded attackers, and guards belatedly arriving to secure the situation. "Are you hurt?" he demanded while checking her for injuries with hands that wanted to be gentle but moved with clinical efficiency born from urgency. "No," Seraphina said through chattering teeth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with shock catching up with her nervous system. "They tried to take me, tried to drag me out through the side entrance, but I remembered what you taught me about never letting anyone move you to a secondary location. So I fought and waited for you to get here." She looked up at him with eyes that held terror and determination in equal measure. "This is what you were afraid of. This is why you wanted to push me away. Because loving me makes me a target for everyone who wants to destroy you." Lucien felt something crack open in his chest as he held his wife surrounded by evidence of exactly how right his fears had been. His enemies had attempted to kidnap her during a celebration in his own home, had been willing to commit mass violence to take her, had proven that no amount of security could completely protect her from threats motivated by destroying Ravenscar authority through the one vulnerability he couldn't eliminate. His father's voice echoed in his head with the clarity of prophecy fulfilled. "Love creates targets. Attachment guarantees suffering. You'll understand this lesson when you watch enemies hurt someone you care about specifically because you were foolish enough to care." But standing there holding Seraphina while she trembled against him, Lucien realized something that felt like fundamental transformation rather than just acceptance of uncomfortable truth. His father had been wrong about one critical thing. Love didn't create vulnerability out of nowhere. It revealed vulnerability that already existed. The difference was whether you faced that vulnerability with someone worth protecting or whether you spent your life alone pretending isolation meant safety. "I was afraid of this," he said roughly. "Terrified that loving you would get you killed, that my enemies would recognize you matter and immediately target you because that's the most efficient way to destroy me. And they just proved I was right to be afraid." He pulled back enough to look at her face, memorizing every detail like he was trying to burn the image into permanent memory. "But I'm done letting fear control me. Done pretending that pushing you away would accomplish anything except making us both miserable. You want to know what I learned tonight? I learned that I'd rather fight beside you and risk losing everything than spend another day trying to protect you by keeping you at distance." His hands framed her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence still staining his clothes. "These people came into my home and tried to take you. That means they've declared war not just on Ravenscar authority, but on everything I actually care about protecting. So here's what happens next. We hunt down every person involved in this attack. We destroy them so completely that no enemy ever considers targeting you again. And we do it together because I'm done pretending you're safer without me." Seraphina's expression shifted from shock to something that looked like fierce pride. Then let's go to war, she said quietly. Let's show these people what happens when they threaten a Ravenscar. Both of us. And in that moment, surrounded by blood and chaos and the wreckage of what should have been a celebration, Duke Lucien Ravenscar and his duchess made a decision that would echo through England's history. They would stop playing defense, stop reacting to threats, stop allowing enemies to dictate the terms of engagement. They would become the threat, together. And God help anyone who'd been foolish enough to think attacking Seraphina Ravenscar was a survivable mistake. The investigation moved with brutal efficiency. Lucien's guards captured 3 attackers alive. His interrogators extracted confessions within hours, using methods that didn't quite constitute torture, but came close enough to terrify anyone witnessing the Duke's fury unleashed without restraint. The truth emerged in fragments that assembled into a conspiracy even more extensive than Winthrop's original scheme. 6 noble houses had coordinated tonight's attack, not the same families from the previous conspiracy. New players who'd watched Winthrop's failure and decided they could succeed where he'd fallen short. They'd hired mercenaries from France, had planned the assault for months, had specifically targeted Seraphina because intelligence suggested she represented the Duke's only genuine vulnerability. Their plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Kidnap the Duchess during a public celebration, hold her hostage while demanding Lucien's cooperation regarding territorial redistribution and parliamentary influence. Use her safety as leverage to force concessions he'd never agree to otherwise. Then kill her anyway once they'd extracted everything valuable, because leaving her alive meant leaving Lucien with motivation for revenge. It was exactly the kind of ruthless strategy his father would have appreciated. Identify the target's weakness, exploit it completely, show no mercy because mercy invited future threats. But they'd miscalculated catastrophically by assuming Seraphina was just a weakness rather than a partner capable of defending herself. And they'd failed to understand that attacking her wouldn't make Lucien surrender. It would transform him into something far more dangerous than the Duke who'd spent years maintaining civilized pretense. Lucien stood in the interrogation chamber listening to the final confession while Seraphina watched from the doorway. She'd insisted on being present despite the brutality she'd witnessed. Had argued that if they were doing this together, she needed to understand the full reality of what protecting their authority actually required. The captured mercenary provided names, locations, financial records proving which families had funded the attack. Everything Lucien needed to systematically dismantle the conspiracy before it could regroup. When the interrogation finished, Lucien turned to Seraphina with an expression that held the cold calculation of someone preparing for total warfare. These families thought they could take you and force my surrender. They're about to learn what happens when you declare war on someone who stopped caring about civilized boundaries. We're going to destroy them, not through legal channels, not through parliamentary maneuvering. We're going to use every weapon at our disposal to ensure they regret threatening you. He moved closer until they stood in the flickering torchlight of the interrogation chamber, surrounded by evidence of exactly how ruthless he could become when protecting what mattered. This is who I am when someone threatens you. This is the monster my father created. If you want to walk away, do it now before you see how dark this gets. Seraphina looked at him with eyes that held no judgment, no fear, just absolute determination. I'm not walking away. I'm standing beside you, and I'm going to help you destroy every person who thought targeting me was acceptable strategy. Not because I'm bloodthirsty, but because they need to understand that threatening a Ravenscar has consequences. Both of us. She took his hand in hers despite the blood still staining his knuckles from earlier combat. So show me how we do this. Show me what total war looks like when a duke stops pretending to be civilized. And then we make sure no enemy ever considers this mistake again. Lucien felt something settle into place in his chest. Not peace exactly, more like acceptance that he'd found someone who could look at the darkest parts of him and choose to stay anyway. Someone strong enough to stand beside him when he became the weapon his father had forged him into. Someone who understood that protecting what you loved sometimes required becoming exactly the monster your enemies feared most. Then let's go hunting, he said quietly. Let's show England what happens when you make a Ravenscar choose between mercy and vengeance. Spoiler alert, we don't choose mercy. The campaign began at dawn. Lucien deployed resources he'd been accumulating for years. Private investigators, financial auditors, former soldiers loyal to Ravenscar interests. He had every family involved in the attack placed under surveillance, had their business dealings examined, had their personal lives investigated for vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Within 3 days, he'd assembled comprehensive intelligence on all 6 houses, their debts, their scandals, their illegal activities, every weakness that could be weaponized against them. And then he struck with surgical precision that left no possibility of recovery. He called in financial debts that bankrupted 2 families overnight. He exposed illegal smuggling operations that resulted in criminal charges against 3 more. He used political influence to block appointments and business licenses. He systematically dismantled the foundations of their authority until they faced complete ruin. But the 6th family presented complications that couldn't be resolved through financial or legal warfare. Lord Ashford had been the primary coordinator of the attack. His estate bordered Ravenscar territory, and he commanded private forces numbering over 200 men. He'd fortified his holdings in anticipation of retaliation, clearly expecting Lucien to come for him directly, which meant this would end in violence that went beyond interrogation chambers and legal consequences. This would require Lucien to become the warrior his father had trained him to be. The predator who could look at another man and decide with absolute certainty that removing him from existence was necessary for survival. Seraphina found him in the armory where he was reviewing weapons and tactical plans with his military commanders. Maps covered the table showing Ashford's estate layout and defensive positions. Lucien was discussing assault strategies with the clinical detachment of someone planning warfare rather than considering the human cost of what he was preparing. She waited until the commanders left before approaching him. "You're planning to attack his estate directly, to kill Lord Ashford and anyone who stands with him." It wasn't a question, just acknowledgement of what she'd already understood from listening to tactical discussions. "Yes," Lucien said without looking up from the maps. "Ashford won't surrender, won't accept exile, won't negotiate. He's fortified his position and he's waiting for me to come to him. So I'll give him what he expects. But I'll do it with overwhelming force that leaves no survivors who might seek revenge later." He finally looked up and met her eyes. "This is the part where you tell me there's another way. Where you argue for mercy or legal resolution. Where you try to convince me that killing Ashford makes me no better than the enemies I'm fighting." Seraphina moved closer and studied the maps with the same tactical focus he'd been applying. "No. This is the part where I ask how I can help. Ashford tried to kidnap me, tried to use me as leverage against you, tried to kill me once he'd extracted everything useful. He doesn't get mercy. He gets eliminated. So tell me what you need from me." Lucien felt something fierce and possessive surge in his chest. His wife wasn't trying to civilize him or soften his response. She was offering to stand beside him while he did what survival required. And that acceptance of who he actually was mattered more than any declaration of love could convey. "I need you to stay here where you're protected. This assault will be brutal. People will die. I can't focus on tactical execution if I'm worried about your safety." "No," Seraphina said firmly. "You told me we do this together. That means I don't hide behind walls while you fight battles. I'm partially responsible for creating. I'm coming with you, not to the front lines, but close enough that these people see we're united. That attacking one Ravenscar means facing both of us. It was tactically unsound, strategically questionable. Everything his training said you never did was bring someone you cared about anywhere near active combat." But looking at his wife's determined expression, Lucien understood something fundamental about the transformation they'd both undergone. They weren't just Duke and Duchess anymore. They were partners who'd chosen to face threats together rather than letting fear separate them. "Fine," he said roughly. "You come. But you follow my security protocols exactly. No deviations, no heroics. And if I tell you to retreat, you retreat without argument." Seraphina smiled slightly despite the gravity of what they were planning. "I can agree to reasonable precautions. Now show me how we end this." The assault on Ashford's estate happened 3 nights later, under conditions that favored surprise over sustained siege. Lucien led 80 men personally, all of them veterans who'd served Ravenscar interests for years. They approached through forest coverage that his scouts had mapped extensively. They positioned artillery to suppress defensive positions. They prepared for the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that would make this night legendary for entirely the wrong reasons. Seraphina rode beside him in the command position, protected by guards but close enough to witness everything about to happen. She wore riding clothes instead of gowns, carried weapons she knew how to use, looked like a duchess preparing for warfare rather than social functions. When they reached the final staging position overlooking Ashford's fortified manor, Lucien turned to her one last time. Last chance to change your mind. What happens next will be violent and ugly, and you can't unsee it once you've witnessed it. Seraphina looked into the manor lit by torches that made it look like something from medieval history rather than modern England. I'm not changing my mind. These people declared war on us. Now they face the consequences. So stop protecting me from reality and start showing them why nobody survives attacking Ravenscars. Lucien felt pride and love and savage anticipation merge into something that made him feel more alive than he'd been in years. This was who he actually was beneath the civilized veneer. A warrior who could look at threats and eliminate them without hesitation. And he'd finally found someone who could witness that darkness and stand beside him anyway. Then let's finish this, he said quietly. He raised his hand and gave the signal that would transform the night into something England's nobility would whisper about for generations. Artillery fired, walls exploded. His forces poured through breaches with coordinated precision. And Duke Lucien Ravenscar led the assault personally, cutting through Ashford's defenders with the kind of lethal efficiency that proved every rumor about Ravenscar ruthlessness had been understatements. The battle became chaos illuminated by fire and moonlight. Steel flashed, men screamed, blood stained expensive carpets and marble floors. Lucien fought through Ashford's defenses like a force of nature, driven by fury that had been building since the moment someone dared threaten his wife in his own home. He found Lord Ashford in the manor's great hall, surrounded by his final defenders making their desperate last stand. The man recognized immediately that he'd lost, that Ravenscar forces had overwhelmed his preparations, that his gamble had failed catastrophically. "Surrender," Ashford said while lowering his sword. "I'll accept exile. Financial ruin. Whatever terms you demand. Just spare my family." Lucien walked forward through smoke and firelight until he stood directly before the man who'd coordinated his wife's attempted kidnapping. When he spoke, his voice carried no mercy, no negotiation, just absolute finality. "You tried to take my wife, tried to use her as leverage, tried to kill her once she'd served your purposes. You declared war on everything I actually care about protecting." He raised his blade with cold precision. "There are no terms, no exile, no mercy. Just consequences. And your consequence is death." The execution happened quickly, efficiently. With the same clinical detachment Lucien had learned from his father's lessons about eliminating threats permanently. Ashford died without ceremony or dramatic final words. Just a man who'd made a fatal miscalculation about how far Duke Lucien Ravenscar would go to protect what mattered. When it was over, Lucien stood in the burning manor, surrounded by evidence of exactly how ruthless he could become when defending his wife. His clothes were soaked with blood and smoke. His hands shook slightly from adrenaline finally dissipating. He looked like a warrior from England's brutal past rather than a duke from its civilized present. Seraphina appeared beside him with guards flanking her protective formation. She looked at the carnage surrounding them without visible horror, just acknowledgement of what had been necessary. "Is it finished?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Lucien said while looking at his blood-stained hands. "Everyone involved in the conspiracy is dead, ruined, or fled England permanently. No one will attempt this again, not after tonight." He finally met her eyes, half expecting to see disgust or fear at witnessing the monster beneath his civilized exterior. Instead, he saw acceptance, understanding, and something that looked like fierce pride in what they'd accomplished together. "Good," Seraphina said simply. "Then let's go home." And as they rode away from Ashford's burning estate with the dawn breaking over England's northern frontier, Duke Lucien Ravenscar understood something that felt like revelation and surrender simultaneously. He'd spent his entire life believing that loving someone made you weak. That attachment created vulnerability enemies would exploit. That caring about anything gave the world weapons to destroy you. But standing beside his wife after eliminating threats that had tried using her against him, he finally understood the truth his father had never grasped. Love didn't make you weak. It made you absolutely terrifying to anyone foolish enough to threaten what you cared about. Because a man with nothing to lose was dangerous. But a man protecting someone worth dying for was unstoppable. They'd survived the conspiracy, survived the attack, survived every test that had tried breaking them apart. Now they just had to figure out how to survive the aftermath, how to live with who they'd become, how to build a future after burning down everything that threatened it. But as Blackthorn Keep came into view with sunrise painting its ancient stones gold and crimson, Lucien felt something he'd never experienced before in his entire life. Hope. Real hope. The kind that came from knowing he wasn't facing the future alone anymore. And whatever came next, they'd face it together. As partners. As equals. As two people who'd learned that true strength wasn't isolation. It was having someone worth protecting and becoming strong enough to keep them safe. The aftermath of Ashford's destruction arrived not with celebration, but with silence that pressed against Blackthorn Keep like physical weight. Lucien stood in his study, watching dawn break over territory he'd just defended through methods that would have made his father proud and his mother weep. Smoke still rose from Ashford's estate 20 miles distant, visible as a dark column against pale morning sky. A monument to what happened when someone threatened a Ravenscar and discovered that survival wasn't negotiable. His hands were clean now. Servants had brought heated water and fresh clothing while he'd stood motionless, letting them work around him like he was furniture that needed maintenance. But he could still feel blood beneath his fingernails, could still smell smoke in his hair, could still hear the screams of men dying because he'd decided their elimination was necessary for protecting what mattered. He'd become exactly what his father had trained him to be. A weapon capable of lethal efficiency without hesitation or remorse. A duke who could look at threats and remove them with the same emotional investment most people applied to trimming hedges. A monster wrapped in aristocratic authority and expensive tailoring. The door opened without knocking. Only one person in the keep would enter his private study uninvited. Seraphina closed it behind her and moved to stand beside him at the windows. She'd changed from riding clothes into a simple morning dress, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger than the woman who'd witnessed battlefield carnage hours earlier. They stood together in silence, watching the smoke column mark where Lord Ashford's ambitions had died, along with everyone who'd chosen to stand with him. The weight between them felt different than the comfortable companionship they'd developed over months of partnership. This was heavier, more complicated. The kind of silence that came from witnessing each other become people neither had been before tonight's violence. Finally, Seraphina spoke with a voice that carried exhaustion and something that might have been grief for the innocents they'd both lost. How many died? 43 of Ashford's forces. 8 of ours. Another dozen wounded who might not survive their injuries. Plus Ashford himself and 3 members of his household staff who chose to fight alongside him. Lucien delivered the numbers with clinical detachment that felt safer than acknowledging the human cost behind each statistic. 60-some people dead because of decisions he'd made, because he'd chosen overwhelming violence over negotiated settlement, because protecting Seraphina mattered more than preserving lives of men who'd targeted her. His father's voice echoed in his head with the clarity of recent conversation rather than childhood memory. This is what leadership requires. The capacity to make brutal decisions without allowing sentiment to compromise strategic necessity. You finally learned that lesson properly. I'm proud of what you've become. The thought made something twist painfully in Lucien's chest. His father would be proud. Would see tonight's massacre as proof that his son had successfully internalized every lesson about power requiring ruthlessness and mercy inviting weakness. Would recognize that Lucien had transformed into exactly the kind of duke the old man had spent decades trying to create. And that recognition felt like discovering he'd contracted a terminal illness he couldn't cure. Do you regret it? Seraphina asked quietly. Regret choosing violence over other options. Regret becoming the person who could order that level of destruction without hesitation. Lucien turned to face her properly for the first time since returning to the keep. Her eyes held no judgment. No condemnation, just genuine curiosity about where his mind had gone after witnessing himself become the monster he'd spent months trying not to become. I regret that it was necessary. Regret that Ashford forced the situation to a point where negotiation wasn't viable. Regret that protecting you required me to kill dozens of people who were just following orders from someone ambitious and stupid. He moved closer until they stood near enough that he could see gold flecks in her brown eyes catching morning light. But I don't regret choosing your safety over their lives. Don't regret eliminating threats that would have kept targeting you until they succeeded or died trying. Don't regret proving to every enemy in England that attacking you means facing consequences they won't survive. His hands framed her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence those same hands had committed hours earlier. What I regret is discovering that my father was right about one thing. To protect what matters in a world that views compassion as weakness, you have to be willing to become the thing everyone fears. You have to be capable of looking at other human beings and deciding with absolute certainty that removing them from existence is necessary for survival. And once you've crossed that line, you can't uncross it. You just learn to live with who you've become. Seraphina placed her hands over his where they rested against her face. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd also crossed lines she couldn't uncross. Your father was wrong about most things, Lucien, but he was right that protecting what you love sometimes requires becoming dangerous. The difference between you and him is that he enjoyed the violence, took satisfaction in demonstrating power through cruelty. You hate it. Hate what you had to become to keep me safe. And that difference matters more than you realize. She pulled his hands down but didn't release them, holding on like she was anchoring both of them to something solid, while everything else felt unstable. We both changed tonight. Both became people we weren't before. Both crossed moral boundaries we thought we'd never approach. But we did it together. And we did it for reasons beyond just accumulating power or demonstrating dominance. We did it because some things are worth protecting, even when protection requires becoming someone you never wanted to be. Tears tracked down her cheeks, though her voice stayed steady. I watched you kill Ashford, watched you execute a man who'd surrendered and asked for mercy, and I felt nothing except satisfaction that he wouldn't threaten us again. What does that make me? What have we become that I can witness execution without feeling horror? The confession broke something open in Lucien's chest. He'd been so focused on his own transformation into the weapon his father had wanted that he hadn't fully considered what this violence had cost Seraphina. She'd chosen to witness it, had insisted on standing beside him through the assault, but witnessing violence and being unchanged by it were different things entirely. She'd lost innocence she couldn't recover, had discovered capacity for ruthlessness she probably wished she didn't possess, had become someone harder and more dangerous because loving him required surviving in his world. It makes you someone who understands that survival isn't about maintaining moral purity, Lucien said roughly. It makes you someone who's learned the same brutal lesson I've been wrestling with my entire life. That sometimes protecting what you love means becoming the villain in someone else's story. And you live with that knowledge by remembering why you made those choices in the first place. He pulled her close and held her while they both processed transformations neither had wanted, but both had chosen. We're not monsters, Seraphina. We're just people who love each other enough to become monstrous when necessary. And maybe that's not something to be proud of, but it's what kept us alive and together. So we figure out how to live with it, how to be the people who can commit violence when required while still being people who care about something beyond just power and survival. They stood there in the study, surrounded by morning light that seemed too clean and innocent for what they'd done during darkness. Eventually, Seraphina pulled back enough to look at his face with an expression that held both love and concern. How do we come back from this? How do we go back to hosting social functions and managing estate operations and pretending to be civilized aristocrats after what we've done? Lucien had been wrestling with that exact question since watching Ashford's estate burn. How did you return to normal life after discovering you were capable of ordering mass slaughter? How did you look at yourself in mirrors without seeing the blood that would never completely wash away? How did you maintain humanity after demonstrating you could discard it when strategically necessary? We don't come back from it, he said with brutal honesty. We just move forward carrying what we've become. We acknowledge that we've changed in ways we can't undo. And we build something worth the cost of those changes. We use the authority we've protected to actually improve lives instead of just maintaining power. We prove that becoming dangerous to defend what matters doesn't mean becoming pointlessly cruel to everyone around us. He guided her to sit on the leather sofa where they'd had so many conversations about strategy and partnership and learning to trust each other. My father became a monster because he enjoyed demonstrating power over others, because cruelty was entertainment and control was its own reward. I refuse to follow that pattern. I'll be dangerous when necessary to protect you and this territory, but I won't let that danger become who I am in every moment. I'll be the duke who can kill when required and the husband who still knows how to be gentle. Both things, simultaneously. And anyone who can't accept that complexity isn't someone whose opinion matters. Seraphina leaned against him with exhaustion, finally catching up to her nervous system. When she spoke, her voice carried a fragile hope that felt more valuable than any certainty could have been. I need you to promise me something. Promise that we'll never become the kind of people who use violence as a first option instead of a last resort. That what happened tonight was necessity rather than preference. That we won't turn into the tyrants your father would have been proud of. Lucien felt the weight of that promise settle into his bones. It would be easy to become those tyrants, to decide that since he'd already crossed moral boundaries, there was no reason not to cross them repeatedly. to let violence become comfortable rather than something that still made his hands shake afterwards. His father had made that choice decades ago and never looked back. But Lucien had something his father never possessed. He had Seraphina. Had someone who'd witnessed his darkness and stayed while still expecting him to be better than the worst version of himself. Had a partner who'd hold him accountable when isolation would have let him become the monster without restrictions. "I promise," he said quietly. "I promise that violence will always be the last option after every other strategy has failed. That I'll never enjoy it the way my father did. That I'll remember tonight's necessity was still tragedy rather than triumph. And I promise that if you ever see me becoming something worse than what circumstances required, you'll tell me immediately, even if that truth is painful." He kissed her forehead with tenderness that felt like reclaiming humanity after hours of being purely a weapon. "We'll carry this together, the guilt, the transformation, the knowledge of what we're capable of when protecting what matters. And we'll use that knowledge to build something better than what came before, something worth the cost we paid to protect it." The days following Ashford's destruction brought investigation from Westminster and shocked whispers throughout England's nobility. Lucien submitted to parliamentary inquiry with cold cooperation that dared them to find legal justification for prosecuting a duke who defended his territory against documented assault. His solicitors presented evidence of the conspiracy. Testimony from captured mercenaries. Financial records proving 6 houses had coordinated the attack. The inquiry concluded within a week with findings that Duke Lucien Ravenscar had acted within legal boundaries when eliminating immediate threats to his person and property. Several parliamentary representatives privately acknowledged they'd have responded identically if facing similar circumstances. Others whispered that Ravenscar's response had been excessively brutal, even accounting for justified defense. Lucien didn't particularly care which interpretation people preferred. He'd protected Seraphina, had eliminated threats permanently, had proven to every potential enemy that targeting the Duchess of Ravenscar was guaranteed suicide. Mission accomplished regardless of public opinion about his methods. But the victory felt hollow when he walked through Blackthorn Keep and saw how the violence had changed things beyond just his own psyche. Servants moved with nervous efficiency instead of comfortable familiarity. Nobles who'd previously sought social invitations now maintained careful distance. Even allies who'd supported him throughout both conspiracies seemed uncertain how to interact with a duke who'd demonstrated exactly how ruthless he could become when someone threatened what he loved. The keep had transformed from a fortress that protected people into something that felt more like a monument to fear. And Lucien recognized with disturbing clarity that he'd become exactly what this territory needed to survive in a brutal world, but also exactly the kind of leader who inspired terror rather than genuine loyalty. The realization hit him one evening while reviewing estate reports that showed productivity declining across tenant farms, not because of weather or market conditions, because workers were afraid of the duke who'd massacred 50-some people in a single night, afraid that any mistake might trigger violence they'd only heard about in whispered stories, afraid to be seen by someone who'd proven he could kill without hesitation when circumstances warranted. He was maintaining order through fear, just like his father had, just like every Ravenscar before him had. The cycle he'd hoped to break by learning to care about something beyond power had reasserted itself. The moment he'd chosen overwhelming violence as the solution to threats against what he cared about. Seraphina found him in the library where he'd gone seeking distraction in military history and found only more evidence that men who learned to kill efficiently rarely learned to stop. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence offering comfort that words couldn't provide. "They're afraid of me now," Lucien said quietly. Not respectfully cautious. Actually afraid. "I see it when servants bring meals, when tenants report problems, when anyone has to interact with me directly. They're terrified I'll react to some minor issue with the same violence I used against Ashford." He set down the book he hadn't actually been reading and looked at his wife with exhaustion that went bone deep. "I wanted to be different than my father. Wanted to prove that caring about something didn't require becoming a tyrant who ruled through intimidation. But the moment someone threatened you, I became exactly what he trained me to be. And now I'm maintaining authority through the same fear-based control he used for 40 years. Seraphina took his hand and held it between both of hers. When she spoke, her voice carried the gentle firmness of someone delivering necessary truth regardless of how uncomfortable it made them both. "You're not your father, Lucien. You're someone who made brutal choices for specific reasons rather than someone who enjoys brutality for its own sake. But you're right that people are afraid. And you're right that fear-based control is unsustainable long-term. So you have to show them something different. Show them that the man who can kill when necessary is also the man who cares about their welfare when killing isn't required. She shifted to face him more directly. Your father never cared whether people thrived or just survived. Never invested in anything beyond demonstrating power. You're different. You've let me restore the gardens. Let me open schools. Let me implement healthcare improvements. Now you need to personally demonstrate that those weren't just my projects. That you support them because you actually care about more than just maintaining control. It was strategic advice delivered with emotional honesty. Seraphina understood that his reputation had been damaged by necessary violence and needed rehabilitation through visible care for the people depending on Ravenscar authority. But she also understood something deeper, that Lucien needed to rehabilitate his own self-perception before he could function as anything beyond a weapon waiting for the next threat to eliminate. How? He asked simply. How do I show them I'm not just the monster who killed Ashford without appearing weak or undermining the fear that keeps actual threats at distance? Seraphina smiled slightly despite the serious nature of their conversation. You do both. You be the Duke who's terrifying to enemies and protective toward people under your authority. You show that strength isn't just capacity for violence. It's also capacity for building something worth protecting. You prove that becoming dangerous to defend what matters doesn't require being dangerous to everyone all the time. She stood and pulled him up with her. Come with me. There's something I need to show you. She led him through corridors to the east wing, where his mother's restored gardens had flourished under Seraphina's careful cultivation. But instead of stopping at the solarium, she continued to a section of the wing that had remained closed even after the gardens reopened. She unlocked a door that revealed his mother's private study, preserved exactly as it had been the day she died 15 years ago. Lucien stopped in the doorway, feeling like he'd been hit. He hadn't entered this room since his mother's funeral, had ordered it sealed because the grief of losing her had been compounded by guilt over not protecting her from his father's systematic emotional cruelty. This space held too many memories of the woman who'd loved him unconditionally and died because she'd loved his father the same way. Seraphina moved to the desk where journals and correspondence lay as if his mother had just stepped away temporarily. She picked up a leather-bound book and brought it to where Lucien still stood frozen. I found these while restoring the gardens. Your mother kept detailed records of her efforts to improve conditions for people living on Ravenscar lands. Healthcare initiatives your father blocked. Educational programs he refused to fund. Agricultural innovations he dismissed as unnecessary expense. She opened the journal to pages filled with his mother's distinctive handwriting. She never succeeded because your father controlled the finances and wouldn't allocate resources for anything he considered sentimental weakness. But she documented everything, every proposal, every rejected plan, every dream she had for using Ravenscar wealth to actually improve lives instead of just accumulating power. Seraphina placed the journal in his hands with careful gentleness. Your mother couldn't implement these ideas because she didn't have authority to override your father. But you do. You have complete control over estate resources, and no one to stop you from using them however you choose. So use them to finish what she started. Use them to prove that becoming dangerous to protect people doesn't mean becoming indifferent to their welfare. Lucien looked at his mother's handwriting documenting dreams she'd never lived to achieve. Plans for expanding medical care to mining villages. Proposals for improving housing conditions. Detailed budgets for educational programs that would have cost less than what his father spent annually on wine and horses. All of it rejected because the old duke had viewed caring about tenant welfare as weakness that undermined aristocratic authority. His mother had died believing she'd failed to make any difference, had spent her final years watching her husband mock every attempt to use their wealth for something beyond just maintaining power, had loved a man incapable of recognizing that love as valuable or returning it with anything beyond contempt disguised as aristocratic necessity. But Lucien wasn't his father, had authority the old man never would have allowed his wife to possess, had resources that could implement every proposal his mother had documented, had the opportunity to finish what she'd started and prove that caring about people wasn't weakness. It was the whole point of having power in the first place. He looked up at Seraphina with eyes that burned from tears he'd been suppressing for 15 years. She would have loved you, would have recognized in you everything she tried to be but couldn't achieve because she'd married someone who viewed compassion as exploitable vulnerability. I know, Seraphina said softly. I found letters she wrote but never sent. Letters to a son she was afraid would become his father. letters begging him to remember that power without purpose becomes prison, that authority without compassion becomes tyranny, that loving something doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. She moved closer and placed one hand over his heart. She'd be proud of you, Lucien. Proud that you fought against becoming your father even when circumstances tried forcing you in that direction. Proud that you learned to love me despite being trained to view attachment as strategic suicide. Proud that you're holding her journal right now and already planning how to implement everything she documented. The truth of that statement settled into his chest like finding something he'd lost years ago and stopped hoping to recover. His mother would be proud, not of the violence he'd committed or the fear he'd inspired, but of the fact that he'd learned to care about something beyond just surviving. That he'd found someone who made caring feel like strength instead of vulnerability. That he was standing here ready to use his authority for purposes beyond just maintaining power. "Help me," he said roughly. "Help me finish what she started. Help me prove that Ravenscar authority can be both protective and caring. Help me become the duke she dreamed I could be instead of the monster my father tried to create." Seraphina pulled him close and held him while 15 years of suppressed grief finally found release. He cried for his mother's wasted dreams and his father's cruelty, and the childhood spent learning that love was weakness, and the years wasted believing that survival required isolation. He cried for becoming the weapon he'd never wanted to be, and for discovering that sometimes being that weapon was necessary to protect what mattered. And when the tears finally stopped, he felt lighter, not because the guilt had disappeared or the blood had washed away, but because he'd finally accepted that carrying those burdens didn't require carrying them alone. That transformation was possible even after becoming someone you never wanted to be. That redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future worth the cost of surviving. The work began the next morning. Lucien called a full assembly of estate managers, tenant representatives, and household staff. He stood before them in the great hall where celebrations and violence had both occurred and spoke with the kind of raw honesty that transformed authority into something resembling genuine leadership. "I know you're afraid of me, afraid of what I did to Lord Ashford and everyone who stood with him, afraid that the Duke who can kill 50 men in one night might turn that violence on anyone who displeases him." His voice carried through the hall with clarity that demanded attention rather than just compliance. "You're right to be afraid. I am capable of that violence when circumstances require it. I am dangerous to anyone who threatens this territory or the people I've sworn to protect. I won't apologize for eliminating threats. Won't pretend to regret keeping you safe from conspiracies that would have destabilized everything we've built." He paused and let that truth settle before continuing. "But fear isn't the foundation I want for Ravenscar authority. My father ruled through intimidation because he viewed caring about your welfare as weakness. I refuse to follow that pattern. So here's what happens next. We're implementing every program my mother proposed before her death. Expanded healthcare for mining villages. Educational opportunities for children, regardless of family income. Housing improvements for workers whose labor creates the wealth that funds this estate." He gestured to Seraphina standing beside him. "The Duchess will oversee these initiatives with full access to estate resources and my complete authority to implement whatever she determines necessary. Anyone who obstructs her work will answer to me personally. Anyone who treats these programs as optional charity rather than fundamental responsibility will find their employment terminated immediately." Lucien looked across the assembled crowd with eyes that held both the hardness of someone who'd killed without hesitation and the determination of someone choosing to be more than just a weapon. "I'm not asking you to stop being afraid of what I can do when this territory is threatened. That fear is realistic and probably healthy. But I am demanding that you recognize I'm also capable of caring whether you thrive or just survive. That Ravenscar authority exists to protect you, not just control you. That becoming dangerous to defend what matters doesn't mean being dangerous to everyone all the time." He stepped forward with the kind of presence that made people pay attention through sheer force of personality rather than fear of consequences. "So here's my promise. I will be ruthless to enemies. I will eliminate threats before they can harm you. I will never apologize for using violence when violence is the only language our opponents understand. But I will also fund your schools. We'll improve your housing. We'll ensure you have access to health care and education and opportunities to build lives worth living, because that's what authority actually means. Not just power over you, responsibility for you." The speech ended in silence that felt more substantial than applause would have achieved. People processed what they'd heard with visible uncertainty about whether they could trust the Duke's words or whether this was manipulation disguised as care. Lucien understood their hesitation. He'd ruled through fear long enough that promises of change sounded suspicious rather than reassuring. But he also understood that rebuilding trust required action rather than just rhetoric. So he stood there and let them see him vulnerable and honest and committed to becoming someone better than his reputation suggested. And gradually, tentatively, people began responding with something that looked almost like hope. The transformation happened slowly. Lucien spent weeks visiting tenant farms personally to hear concerns and implement solutions. He rode through mining villages talking to workers about safety improvements and healthcare access. He attended school openings and medical clinic dedications and housing construction projects. He showed his face in communities that had only ever seen him as a distant authority figure who collected rents and expected obedience. And gradually, carefully, fear began transforming into something more complicated. People still respected his capacity for violence, still understood that threatening Ravenscar interests meant facing consequences they wouldn't survive. But they also started recognizing that the Duke who'd massacred Ashford's forces was the same Duke funding their children's education and improving their living conditions. He wasn't just a weapon anymore, he was a protector. Someone dangerous to enemies but invested in the welfare of people under his authority. Someone who could kill when necessary and care about healthcare access simultaneously. Both things. At the same time, without contradiction. Seraphina watched the transformation with pride that made Lucien's chest tighten painfully whenever he caught her looking at him like he'd accomplished something remarkable instead of just implementing basic human decency his mother had proposed decades earlier. She'd believed he was capable of becoming someone better than his father's legacy suggested, had stood beside him through violence and conspiracy and transformation, had loved him when he was just a weapon, and loved him still while he learned to be more than that. One evening, they stood in the restored gardens watching sunset paint the sky in colors that matched the hope Lucien was learning to feel instead of just intellectually acknowledge. Seraphina leaned against him with comfortable ease that spoke of months spent building trust and partnership and love that had survived being weaponized by enemies. "You did it," she said quietly. "You broke the cycle. You became someone who can be both dangerous and caring. Both the weapon when necessary and the leader who actually gives a damn whether people thrive." Lucien pulled her closer and rested his chin on top of her head while breathing in the lavender scent that had become synonymous with home and safety and everything worth protecting. "We did it. You showed me it was possible. Showed me that becoming the monster to defend what matters doesn't require staying the monster in every other moment. Showed me that my father's lessons were poison designed to keep me isolated and miserable. You're the reason I'm standing here instead of ruling through fear alone like every Ravenscar before me." He turned her to face him with hands that had learned gentleness after years of only knowing violence. "I love you, Seraphina Ravenscar. Love you for walking into this fortress and refusing to accept that I was just a title and a reputation. Love you for making me want to become someone worth loving instead of just someone powerful. Love you for standing beside me through conspiracies and violence and transformation. Love you for believing I was capable of being better, even when I'd given you every reason to think otherwise." Seraphina smiled with eyes that held tears and joy simultaneously. "I love you too. Love you for choosing to learn, for fighting against becoming your father, even when it would have been easier to just accept that destiny, for proving that changing is possible even after becoming someone you never wanted to be, for being brave enough to love me despite being trained to view attachment as weakness." She kissed him slowly with the kind of tenderness that made violence feel like distant nightmare rather than recent memory. "We're going to be legendary, you know? The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar who transformed this territory from a fortress ruled by fear into something that actually takes care of people. The couple who proved that power and compassion aren't contradictory, that becoming dangerous to protect what matters doesn't require being cruel to everyone around you." Lucien held her while watching sunset fade into twilight over the territory that finally felt like something worth protecting beyond just maintaining his authority. He'd spent 32 years believing that loving someone made you vulnerable, that attachment created weaknesses enemies would exploit, that caring about anything gave the world weapons to destroy you. But standing here holding his wife while workers in distant villages went home to families that could afford healthcare and education because of programs he'd implemented, Lucien finally understood the truth his father had never grasped. Love didn't make you vulnerable. It made you accountable, made you responsible for being worthy of the trust someone placed in you. made you want to build something better than what came before because you had someone worth building it for. And that accountability was what transformed power from just control into something resembling genuine leadership. What transformed authority from just fear into something people actively wanted to protect. What transformed him from just a weapon into someone who knew when violence was necessary and when compassion was stronger. Years later, Duke Lucien Ravenscar would be remembered throughout England as the ruler who transformed northern territories from feared borderlands into prosperous communities. Historians would document his expansion of education and healthcare. Political scholars would analyze how he'd maintained iron authority while implementing progressive social programs. Future generations would study Ravenscar governance as the model for enlightened aristocratic leadership, but Lucien himself would remember something simpler. He'd remember the moment he'd chosen to love his wife, despite knowing it made him vulnerable. The moment he'd chosen to implement his mother's dreams, despite being trained to view compassion as weakness. The moment he'd chosen to become someone better than his father's legacy while maintaining the strength necessary to protect what mattered. He'd remember that transformation wasn't about becoming soft or abandoning the capacity for ruthlessness when circumstances required it. It was about knowing the difference between necessary violence and pointless cruelty. About choosing to care about people's welfare instead of just demanding obedience. About building something worth the cost of protecting it. He'd remember standing in restored gardens beside the woman who'd walked into his fortress and refused to accept that isolation meant strength, who'd loved him when he was just a weapon, and loved him still after helping him become something more, who'd stood beside him through conspiracies and violence and proven that vulnerability wasn't weakness when you faced it together. And on quiet evenings, when the weight of authority felt overwhelming and the memory of violence made sleep difficult, Seraphina would find him in their chambers and remind him with touch and words and presence that he wasn't alone anymore. That transformation was ongoing rather than completed. That becoming someone worthy of love required constant work, but the work was worth doing. Together, they would stand at windows overlooking territory they'd defended through methods both brutal and compassionate. Territory that had survived because they'd been willing to become dangerous when necessary and caring when possible. Territory that thrived because authority had evolved beyond just fear into something resembling actual leadership. And they would hold each other while acknowledging a truth that had taken years of violence and growth and transformation to fully understand. Power wasn't about controlling people through intimidation. It was about being strong enough to protect them when threats emerged and wise enough to improve their lives when violence wasn't required. It was about knowing which tools circumstances demanded and having courage to use it regardless of how it complicated your self-perception. Love wasn't about weakness or vulnerability or giving enemies weapons to use against you. It was about finding someone worth protecting and becoming strong enough to keep them safe. About building partnership that survived being weaponized. About choosing daily to be worthy of trust someone had placed in you despite knowing you were dangerous. And together, power and love created something neither could achieve alone. They created the possibility of becoming more than what your past dictated, of breaking cycles that had destroyed previous generations, of proving that transformation was possible even after becoming someone you never wanted to be. Duke Lucien Ravenscar had spent his life learning to survive. It took falling in love with a woman stubborn enough to refuse accepting his isolation to finally learn how to actually live. And standing in Blackthorn Keep, watching another sunset paint the sky in colors that promised tomorrow would arrive despite yesterday's darkness, he finally understood what his mother had tried teaching him before his father's poison drowned out her voice. True strength wasn't never falling. It was learning to stand back up after falling and choosing to become someone better than the person who'd fallen. True power wasn't dominating everyone around you. It was having the capacity for violence while maintaining the judgment to know when care accomplished more than cruelty. True love wasn't weakness. It was the courage to let someone matter enough that losing them would destroy you, and choosing daily to be worthy of them, staying anyway. The Ravenscars had survived wars and betrayals and conspiracies through brutal efficiency and intimidation. They would thrive through the next generations because one duke had learned that survival alone wasn't enough. That legacy required building something worth passing down rather than just maintaining control. And it all started the night a woman walked into his fortress, refusing to kneel before anyone. And he'd been brave enough to recognize that maybe the greatest threat he'd ever face was losing someone who saw through his armor to the man underneath and chose to stay anyway. That was true power. That was real strength. That was what made every bloody battle and brutal choice and difficult transformation worth surviving. And as stars emerged above Blackthorn Keep, marking the transition from twilight to darkness, Duke Lucien Ravenscar held his wife and felt something he'd spent 32 years believing was impossible. Peace. Real peace. The kind that came from knowing you'd fought for something worth protecting and chosen to become someone worthy of what you'd fought for. The kind that came from loving someone brave enough to walk into your darkness and stubborn enough to drag you back toward light. The kind worth every sacrifice required to achieve it.